You could have sold this ring, Jackson Walker said, his voice low and dangerous in that crowded room. Every man in here knows what it's worth. So why didn't you? Ethan Parker, 20 years old, dirty boots, empty stomach, looked the most feared man in the Nevada desert straight in the eye and answered without flinching. Because it wasn't mine. The room went dead silent. 350 Hell's Angels, and not one of them moved. If you've ever had nothing left but your own conscience, you need to hear this story. Subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Ethan Parker had been running for 7 months by the time he found the ring. Not running the way people ran in movies. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not even particularly fast. Just the slow grinding, invisible kind of running that happened when a person had nowhere to go and learned that standing still in one place too long made them a target. He'd left Nevada the way a lot of young men left Nevada, with nothing planned, nothing packed properly, and nothing waiting on the other side. Just a backpack that was older than his last relationship with anyone who claimed to love him, a jacket with a busted zipper that he held shut with one hand in cold weather, and approximately $43 in crumpled bills he'd pulled from the coffee tin his aunt kept behind the kitchen cabinet before he walked out for the last time. He hadn't stolen it. She told him once when he was 16, and she was still sober enough to mean things, that the money in that tin was for emergencies. He figured leaving qualified. He was wrong about a lot of things in those 7 months. He was wrong about how easy it would be to find work if you were young and willing. He was wrong about how long $43 could stretch when you were sleeping outside. He was wrong about people, sometimes in the hopeful direction, usually in the other one. But he wasn't wrong about leaving. That part he was sure of every single day, even on the worst ones. The worst ones had been bad enough that he didn't let himself think about them too directly. By the time May turned into a dry, furious June, Ethan had found a kind of rhythm out near the abandoned highway stretch that locals called the Flat, a long, cracked corridor of old asphalt, about 14 miles outside Las Vegas proper, where the motels had shuttered, the gas stations had caved in on themselves, and the only thing still standing were the billboard frames stripped of their advertisements and rusted down to bare iron skeletons against the white sky. He'd found a drainage culvert on the south side of the road that stayed dry even when the rare desert rainstorm blew through, and he'd turned it into something as close to a home as he'd had since February. He kept it clean. That mattered to him. He couldn't explain why exactly, except that it was one of the few things in his life he could control, so he controlled it completely. He ate when he could. There was a truck stop 4 miles east where the overnight manager, a heavy-set woman named Darlene who wore the same blue vest every single shift, had caught him once going through the dumpster out back, and instead of calling anyone, she'd started leaving a paper bag on top of the bin every Thursday night. She never acknowledged it. He never thanked her directly. But every Friday morning without fail, there was a bag with 2 sandwiches, a bag of chips, and a juice box. And Ethan ate every bite of it slowly, the way he'd learned to eat everything, making it last, tasting it completely, because you never knew how many hours it would have to carry you. That Thursday, the Thursday that changed everything, he wasn't at the truck stop. He was working the dry gully that ran along the north side of the Flat, maybe 100 yards off the road, where the wind sometimes pushed things loose, debris, plastic bags, the occasional piece of clothing or gear that had fallen from a truck or a car and rolled. It wasn't scavenging, he told himself. It was surveying. He was surveying the territory. He'd found a perfectly good pair of work gloves 2 weeks ago and a sealed water bottle the week before that. So the gully had earned a regular inspection. He was moving slow, head down the sun, already hammering the back of his neck, even though it was barely past 9 in the morning when he kicked something with his boot and felt the resistance, not the soft give of dirt or the crinkle of plastic, but something solid. He stopped. He crouched down. He started to dig with his fingers, and the ring came loose from the packed earth like it had been waiting. His first clear thought was, this is gold. His second thought was real gold. His third thought took longer to form because it required him to actually look at the thing properly, to turn it over in his fingers to read what was engraved on its face and what was inscribed along the band. The ring was heavy, not enormously large, but with that specific weight that meant substance quality, something made to last. The face had a design worked into it that Ethan recognized immediately, even though he'd never had a reason to be familiar with it up close, a death's head. Wings spread, the unmistakable symbol associated with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. He'd seen patches like it on the backs of vests in gas stations and truck stops in 3 different states over the past 7 months, always giving those men a respectful amount of space, the way everyone did, not out of specific fear, but out of the general social understanding that you didn't insert yourself into situations you didn't belong in. The name on the inside of the band had been engraved with care, Jackson Stone Walker. Ethan sat in the dirt of the gully for a long time. His brain did the math the way survival brains did math. The ring was gold, real gold, and a pawn shop in Las Vegas would give him at least $300 for it, possibly four, possibly more, if the buyer was honest about the weight and the purity. $300 or $400 was 4 weeks of safety. It was a motel room with a lock on the door, and a shower where you controlled the temperature. It was restaurant food, real food. Food that came on plates and had more than 2 ingredients. It was a bus ticket if he decided he wanted to go somewhere. It was the difference between where he was and somewhere else was where every single cell in his body told him he should be. He understood all of that completely. He sat with it for several minutes, turning the ring over and over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, feeling what that weight could mean. Then he thought about the name. Jackson Walker hadn't lost a piece of jewelry. Jackson Walker had lost something that meant something. Something with that kind of symbol on it didn't get worn casually, and something that weighty didn't slip off a finger by accident. It had been here in the dirt, which meant it had been taken or dropped in a situation serious enough that recovering it afterward wasn't possible. Ethan didn't know the full story, but he knew what it felt like when something was taken from you, and he knew in that deep cellular bone-level way that only people who'd been thoroughly cleaned out by the world actually knew what it felt like to have something that mattered disappear and not come back. He wasn't going to sell it. He made that decision quietly, without drama, without any particular ceremony. He just made it the way he made all his decisions out here, practically after laying out the options, accepting what he was going to do next. Then he sat there another few minutes thinking about how exactly a homeless 20-year-old with no phone and no connections was supposed to return a ring to the president of a Hells Angels chapter. He started by walking to the truck stop and asking Darlene if she had Wi-Fi he could use on the old library tablet he'd been carrying since Reno. She looked at him over her reading glasses, looked at the tablet, then pointed at the outlet by the window booth, without a word. He sat there for 2 hours using the truck stop Wi-Fi and every search term he could think of, and by the time he left he had a name, the chapter, the general territory. A clubhouse location that came up in an old local news article from 3 years back about a charity toy drive of all things. He wrote the address on the inside of his wrist in ballpoint pen, covered it with his sleeve, and started walking. It took him most of the rest of that day and part of the next morning to get close. He hitched one ride from a produce truck driver who talked the entire time about his daughter's soccer tournament, and he walked the rest. By the time the building came into view, a converted industrial space set back from the road, with a gravel lot full of motorcycles, his legs ached and his mouth was dry, and he had exactly one thought left, which was that he was about to walk into a very large gathering of very serious people to hand back something valuable, and he had no idea how that was going to go. He stopped at the edge of the gravel lot. He counted the bikes. He stopped, counting at 40. He took a slow breath, put his hand in his jacket pocket where the ring was wrapped in the piece of cloth he'd torn from an old shirt, and he walked across the gravel. The man at the door was built like a load-bearing wall, wide across the shoulder, forearms covered in ink, and wearing an expression that communicated with absolute precision that whatever Ethan was about to say had better be worth the interruption. He looked Ethan up and down, once taking in the backpack, the dirty jacket, the boots, the general architecture of a young man who'd been living rough for a while. "We're not running a shelter," the man said. Not unkindly, just flatly. "I'm not looking for one," Ethan said. "I need to return something to Jackson Walker, to Stone. I found something that belongs to him." The man's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted, a small recalibration, an adjustment to a variable that hadn't been in the equation a moment ago. "Found something?" "Yes, sir." "What kind of something?" Ethan reached slowly, carefully, making sure his movements were readable. Nothing sudden into his jacket pocket, and produced the cloth-wrapped ring. He held it out in his open palm, unwrapped it with 2 fingers, and let the man see it. The man looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan, then back at the ring. "Don't move," the man said, and went inside. Ethan stood in the sun for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 minutes. He could hear the sound of voice and machinery and music from inside the normal sounds of a large group of people gathered somewhere. He didn't move. He'd been told not to move, and he didn't have any particular interest in ignoring that instruction. When the door opened again, it opened wider, and the man who came out was not the same man who'd gone in. Ethan knew who Jackson Walker was before the man said a word. Not because he'd seen a picture, but because some people walked into space in a way that made the air around them reorganize itself. Jackson Walker was probably late 50s, built with the kind of muscle that came from decades of physical work rather than a gym, with gray cut through his dark beard and eyes that were the specific color of weathered stone. He wore his vest like it was a part of him rather than something he'd put on. He looked at Ethan the way a man looked at something he wasn't quite sure how to categorize. "You found my ring," Jackson said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Out in the gully off the flat. Buried pretty deep. Figured it belonged to you." Jackson looked at the ring sitting in Ethan's outstretched palm. He didn't take it yet. His eyes moved from the ring to Ethan's face, and he read something there. Ethan could see him reading it, could see the careful, unhurried process of a man who'd learned to assess people accurately and had lived long enough to trust that skill. "You walked out here to return this," Jackson said. "Hitched part of the way," Ethan admitted. "From where the flat, the stretch out near the old Callaway sign." Jackson's jaw moved slightly. "That's 14 miles, give or take." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Come inside," he said. Then he turned and went back through the door. Ethan followed him in. The inside of the clubhouse hit him all at once, the sound, the warmth, the density of bodies, the smell of coffee and oil and leather. There were men everywhere, some at tables, some standing in groups along the walls, some working on equipment in the back. The conversations didn't stop when Ethan entered, but they adjusted the way conversations did when something new and unaccounted for walked into a room. Heads turned, eyes tracked. Ethan kept his own eyes forward and followed Jackson Walker through the space. Jackson stopped when he reached the center of the room, and when he stopped, the conversations did too, not all at once, but in a wave that moved outward from him like ripples. Within about 20 seconds, the room was quiet enough that Ethan could hear the mechanical sound of a refrigerator compressor cycling somewhere in the back. There were a lot of men in that room, a lot of men looking at Ethan. Jackson turned to face him, and his voice when he spoke carried without effort to every corner of the space. "This young man walked 14 miles to return this," he said, and held up the ring so the room could see it. Nobody moved. "He found it out on the flat," Jackson continued, "in the gully." He let that land for a moment because the men in this room all knew what that meant. They all knew the ring had been gone for 2 weeks. They all knew the circumstances under which it had disappeared, and they all understood what it meant that a stranger had brought it back, rather than cashing it in. Jackson looked at Ethan again. "You could have sold this," he said. His voice had dropped back to something quieter, more direct, meant for the two of them, even though the room was listening. "Every man in here knows what it's worth. So why didn't you?" Ethan met his eyes. "Because it wasn't mine," he said. The silence held. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, a man started clapping a slow, deliberate sound that was nothing like applause and everything like respect. A second man joined. Then a third, not enthusiastic, not performative, just steady, considered acknowledgement, the way men who didn't give recognition easily gave it when they meant it. Jackson looked at Ethan for another long moment, and whatever calculation he'd been running behind those stone-colored eyes reached its conclusion. "Sit down," Jackson said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday." Ethan almost said he was fine. He'd gotten so practiced at saying he was fine that the words formed automatically. But he looked at the table Jackson was gesturing toward, and he thought about the fact that his last real meal was the sandwich Darlene had left him 36 hours ago, and instead of saying he was fine, he sat down. A woman appeared, not young, not old, with the efficient movements of someone who ran a large kitchen and didn't tolerate wasted motion, and set a plate in front of him without being asked. Eggs, toast, potatoes, the kind of breakfast that required heat and a real stove and multiple ingredients. Ethan stared at it for exactly 1 second before he started eating, and he tried to eat slowly, but the food kept defeating his attempts at dignity. Jackson sat across from him and watched him eat without comment. When Ethan looked up, Jackson said, "What's your name?" "Ethan Parker." How long have you been out on the flat, Ethan? Ethan chewed swallowed. About 3 weeks in that spot. 7 months on the road generally. Jackson absorbed that. How old are you? 20. Something moved across Jackson's face that wasn't quite pity. Pity had softness in it, and this was harder than that, more complicated. It was closer to recognition. Where'd you come from originally? Jackson asked. Nevada. Well, here, sort of. Grew up outside of Henderson. Ethan paused. I left. People don't usually end up sleeping in culverts because things were going great, Jackson said. There was no judgment in his voice, just the statement of a man who'd seen a lot and filtered out the need to perform shock about any of it. Ethan kept eating. After a moment, he said, my father had a plan for my life that involved me staying quiet about some things I didn't want to stay quiet about. And some people connected to my father had plans that involved me, specifically none of which were in my best interest. He paused. So I left. Alone. I had a friend for the first 2 months. He didn't elaborate and Jackson didn't push. The ring, Jackson said after a moment. I want to know exactly where you found it. Exact location. Ethan described it, the gully, the distance from the billboard frame, how deep it was buried, the direction it was facing. Jackson listened with a stillness that had nothing to do with inattention and everything to do with the man filing information in a place where he could use it. It wasn't lost, Jackson said finally. Not to Ethan specifically, more like a statement he was making to himself or to the room, which had stayed quieter than it probably normally was. Men continuing their activities at reduced volume but not having dispersed. It was put there. Ethan looked up from his plate. Someone buried it. Jackson's jaw set. Someone wanted it gone. Wanted it to look like I'd lost it. Like we were getting sloppy. He tapped the table once with one finger, a single controlled motion. 2 weeks ago, I attended a city council meeting about the new development project on the east side. The next morning, the ring was gone. I thought I'd left it somewhere, spent 3 days looking. He looked at Ethan steadily. Somebody took it, planted it out there, figuring it would either stay buried or turn up in a pawn shop. Ethan set his fork down slowly. So it coming back is a problem for whoever took it. Jackson almost smiled. You're fast. I've had to be. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, studying Ethan with a look that had shifted from assessment into something else, something that was closer to consideration. You walked 14 miles to return something you could have sold. That says something about you. He paused. It also puts you in a slightly uncomfortable position given that returning it disrupts someone's plan. I didn't know that when I came, Ethan said. I know you didn't. Jackson was quiet for a moment. But you know it now, and that changes things. Ethan looked at his plate. He'd eaten everything on it without fully registering the process, which was probably the most honest measure of how hungry he had actually been. His stomach felt warm and solid in a way it hadn't in longer than he wanted to calculate. I can go, Ethan said. I wasn't trying to get into the middle of something. You already are, Jackson said, not unkindly. Going doesn't change that. He unfolded his arms and placed both hands flat on the table. Here's what I want to offer you, a room. A real room with a bed and a door that locks. A few days to get straight, get fed, get some sleep. Nothing owed, nothing expected. He held Ethan's gaze. Just because you did the right thing and because I've got the ability to do something about it. Ethan looked at him. Every instinct he'd developed over 7 months, the ones that had kept him alive and unrobbed and unbeholden to anyone, every one of those instincts generated some kind of caution signal. He'd learned not to accept things without understanding the con. He'd learned that people who offered things usually wanted something back. He'd learned that kindness in a stranger's face was the most complicated thing in the world to read correctly. But he'd also learned slowly and painfully to distinguish between caution that was protecting him and caution that was just keeping him in a ditch. Why, he asked, not challenging, genuinely needing to understand. Jackson looked at him for a long moment before he answered. Because 30 years ago, somebody offered me a chair and a meal when I had nothing, and I never forgot it. He picked up his coffee cup and held it between both hands. That's the whole answer. No other reason. Ethan was quiet. The room moved around them, conversations resuming, equipment, clanking boots on concrete. Normal sounds of a normal space full of people who all had somewhere to be and things to do. Okay, Ethan said finally. Jackson nodded once. Then he signaled to a man nearby, mid-40s, with a gray streak in his dark hair and the look of someone who served a practical function in this organization, and said, "Get him set up in the back room, the one with the working heat." The man looked at Ethan. "Come on, kid," he said, not unkindly. "You smell like 3 weeks in a drainage ditch." Ethan almost laughed. It might have been the first time anything had been close to funny and longer than he could precisely calculate. He picked up his backpack and followed. The room in the back was small, and the bed in it had a frame and a real mattress and 2 blankets, and the bathroom down the hall had hot water that worked on the first try. Ethan stood in the shower for 12 minutes. He counted and let the water run until the temperature started dropping. Then he dried off with a real towel and put on the change of clothes from the bottom of his pack, the ones he saved for situations when cleanliness might actually matter. And he sat on the edge of the bed and felt the specific quiet of a place where the walls kept the wind out. He didn't sleep right away. He sat with the ring in his head, the weight of it, the decision he'd made out in the gully, the thing Jackson had said. It was put there, not lost, placed, which meant somebody had taken it, somebody who knew where Jackson Walker lived and what his habits were, and how to get close enough to take something off a man's hand or out of his things, and that somebody had a reason for wanting the ring gone. A reason that had to do with Jackson's organization appearing sloppy, careless, out of control. Ethan didn't know who Victor Caldwell was yet. He didn't know that within 48 hours he would. He didn't know that the ring he dug out of the dirt with his bare fingers was the opening move in something much larger than a stolen piece of jewelry, that it was connected to money and development contracts, and a city council vote, and a man who had spent 3 years constructing a careful, deliberate story about who the Hells Angels were and what they represented to the community. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was that his stomach was full, and the room was warm, and he could hear through the wall the sounds of a lot of people moving through their evening, talking, laughing, someone playing guitar badly but enthusiastically in another part of the building. He hadn't heard that kind of sound, the casual, unconscious sound of people who were comfortable where they were in a very long time. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then, for the first time in 7 months, he slept before midnight. The next morning started early and loud. Ethan woke to the sound of motorcycles and voices and the smell of coffee, so strong it apparently migrated through walls, and he lay there for a moment in that specific disorientation of waking up somewhere safe after too long spent somewhere that wasn't. Then he pulled himself together, laced up his boots, and went to find the source of the coffee. The main space of the clubhouse was different in the morning. Fewer people, more business, the sense of a place shifting from social to functional. 2 men were at a table with what looked like invoices spread out between them. Someone was on the phone in the corner, talking in a low, continuous voice about delivery schedules. The television mounted on the far wall was on a local news channel with the sound barely audible. A man named Reeves, the one with the gray streak, who'd got man Ethan set up the night before, poured him a coffee without being asked and handed it over with the no-frills economy of someone who'd gotten up an hour ago and was already past the part of the morning that required ceremony. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Better than I have in months," Ethan said honestly. Reeves grunted in a way that seemed to indicate this was the expected and reasonable outcome of sleeping in a bed. "Stone wants to talk to you after breakfast. Help yourself." He gestured toward the kitchen area. Breakfast was oatmeal and eggs, and somebody had made biscuits, real ones, and Ethan ate and listened to the sounds of the place going about its morning and tried to understand what kind of place this was, because it wasn't what he'd expected. He'd had a picture in his head, not a specific one, just the general picture that 7 months of outsider status had given him of what this world probably looked like from inside. He'd expected something raw or louder, more explicitly aggressive. What he'd found instead was something that felt in its bones like a working organization. People with roles, people with responsibilities, people who argued about logistics and schedules and who owed whom a favor and what needed to get done this week. It felt more like a union hall than anything else, if he was being honest. More like the kind of place where people showed up because they meant something to each other. He was still working through that when Jackson Walker appeared in the doorway and said, "Come talk to me." Jackson's office, a back room with a desk and a whiteboard, and walls covered with maps and what looked like a combination of organizational charts and community contact information, smelled like coffee and old paper and machine oil. Jackson sat behind the desk and gestured Ethan to a chair, And then he put his hands together on the desk and looked at Ethan with the same unblinking attentiveness he'd applied the night before. "Tell me what you saw out on the flat," Jackson said, "in the 2 or 3 weeks before you found the ring. What was moving around out there? People, vehicles, anything unusual?" Ethan thought. He had a good memory for this kind of thing. Survival in open terrain required you to notice patterns and remember deviations from them, and he'd been paying that kind of attention for 7 months. "White pickup," he said, "new or close to new. Came through 3 times that I saw, once in the late afternoon about 2.5 weeks ago, once at night about a week and a half ago, and once in the morning, maybe 10 days ago. Not a work truck, the bed was clean. Never stopped long. Pulled off the road for a few minutes each time, then left." Jackson went very still. "Did you see who was driving?" "Not the first 2 times. Third time he pulled off closer to where I was close enough that I saw him get out and look around. Older guy, maybe 60, 65, dressed like he was going to a business lunch, not driving around in the desert." Ethan paused. He had a phone out and he was taking pictures of something on the ground. Then he got back in the truck and drove away. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. His jaw was doing that controlled tension thing again. "Victor Caldwell drives a white truck," Jackson said. The name meant nothing to Ethan yet, but the way Jackson said it with the specific flatness of a man setting a heavy object down on a table told him it should. "Who is Victor Caldwell?" Ethan asked. Jackson picked up a pen and turned it over in his fingers. "A developer. Been buying up property on the east side of the city for about 3 years. Got most of what he needs. But there's a block he can't get historic designation, community opposition, complicated ownership situation. He needs a city council vote to clear the way, and the vote's in 6 weeks. He set the pen down. "We've been part of the opposition, organized community meetings, helped families understand their rights, connected people with legal resources. Caldwell spent 2 years trying to discredit us newspaper stories, anonymous tips to the county, the whole effort." He looked at Ethan directly. "Losing this ring was supposed to be another chapter in that story. Proof that we're disorganized. Proof that we're careless. Proof that you shouldn't trust us to have your community's back." Ethan processed this, but the ring came back. The ring came back. Which means his evidence is gone. Which means, Jackson said, that the young man who returned it just became relevant to Victor Caldwell's timeline. The room was quiet except for the sounds of the building around them. Ethan thought about the white truck, the man in business clothes photographing the ground, the calculated, methodical patience of someone who planned things across weeks and months and didn't improvise. He thought about what it felt like to be something in someone else's plan. He'd spent 7 months trying to get out from under that feeling. "I didn't choose any of this," he said. "I know where dial down my mission, I know," Jackson said, but choices have a way of choosing you right back." He looked at Ethan with something that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite warning and wasn't quite promise. It was all 3 of those things happening simultaneously behind those gray eyes. "I'm going to tell you the truth about what returning that ring might mean, and then you're going to get to decide what you do next. But I'm not going to lie to you about the situation." Ethan nodded. "Caldwell has money and connections and 3 years of built infrastructure around this plan," Jackson said. "He's not going to fold because the ring turned up. He's going to pivot, and the most likely direction he pivots is toward you, toward making you part of a different story. A young man, homeless, vulnerable, who got manipulated by a dangerous organization." "I wasn't manipulated," Ethan said. The words came out with more force than he intended. "I know that," Jackson said. "You know that? But Caldwell doesn't care about the truth of it. He cares about the story of Britain, and a story about a 20-year-old runaway being used by a motorcycle club plays a lot more cleanly than a story about a corporation trying to bulldoze a neighborhood." Ethan felt something move through him. Not fear exactly, because fear was a thing he'd learned to put in its correct compartment and not let run loose. It was closer to clarity. The kind that came when a situation revealed its actual shape after you'd been looking at the silhouette. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Jackson looked at him for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "That's not a negotiation. You don't owe this chapter anything. You return the ring. That's the end of your obligation." "But," Ethan said, Jackson didn't look away, "but if you're willing to tell your story in your own words, how you found it, what you decided, why, that changes the shape of what Caldwell has to work with." He paused. And it would help people who are trying to stay in their homes. Ethan looked at the maps on the wall, at the community contact sheets with their lists of names and phone numbers, at the whiteboard with its logistics and schedules, the organized, documented infrastructure of people who were working at something that mattered. He thought about Darlene leaving a bag on top of a dumpster every Thursday, about the produce driver talking about his daughter's soccer tournament, about all the small, uncelebrated acts of one person deciding another person mattered enough to do something about. He looked back at Jackson Walker. "Tell me about the community meeting," he said. Jackson looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. And whatever Ethan Parker had been before he walked across that gravel lot, whatever the word was for a 20-year-old who'd survived 7 months alone by keeping his head down and his expectations at floor level, he stopped being that person in that moment. He didn't know it yet, but Jackson did. The community meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, 6 days away, and between now and then, Jackson Walker had a problem that had nothing to do with Victor Caldwell. The problem was Ethan Parker. Not Ethan himself. Jackson had read people for 35 years, and what he'd read in that young man's face was about as clean as anything he'd encountered in a long time. Honest the way people were honest when they'd had the dishonesty burned out of them by circumstance rather than raised out of them by comfort. That kind of honesty was actually more reliable in Jackson's experience. It had been tested. The problem was what Ethan represented to the people in this building. Jackson understood his chapter. He'd built most of it from the ground up over 2 decades, and he knew exactly how each man in it processed new information, new people, new variables. Some of them were going to be fine. Some of them were going to need convincing. And a few of them, specifically 3, specifically the ones who'd been around long enough to have opinions cemented in place like rebar in concrete, were going to push back hard on the idea of a 20-year-old runaway with an unknown history becoming any kind of factor in what was already a complicated situation. The first one came to Jackson's office before lunch. His name was Garrett, mid-50s, had been with the chapter longer than anyone except Jackson himself, and wore his skepticism like a second vest. He closed the office door behind him, which meant he didn't want an audience for what he was about to say, which meant he already knew it wasn't going to land softly. "Talk to me about the kid," Garrett said. "His name is Ethan," Jackson said. "I know his name. Talk to me about why he's in the back room." Jackson leaned back in his chair. He returned the ring. "I offered him a place to stay." "You offered him a place to stay in our building," Garrett said, "when we don't know one single thing about him except that he found something valuable and didn't sell it, which I'll give him that takes a certain kind of character. But character in one situation doesn't tell you everything about a person." "No," Jackson agreed. "It doesn't. It tells you something." Garrett folded his arms. "We're 6 weeks out from a council vote that Caldwell has been building toward for 3 years. Our position is not exactly airtight right now. We've got a public image problem that he's been feeding since before most people in the city knew his name, and we're 6 weeks out from either winning this thing or watching him buy the votes he needs. This is not the moment to introduce an unknown element." "The unknown element," Jackson said, "is the reason we still have the ring." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I know that." He also saw Caldwell's truck 3 times, close enough to give us a description and a timeline. Garrett's expression shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. That was new information, and Garrett, whatever else he was a man who adjusted to new information. "He told you that this morning before you came in." Garrett unfolded his arms and put one hand on the back of the chair across from Jackson's desk, but didn't sit down. He stood there for a moment in that particular posture of a man revising his position without being willing to announce the revision out loud. "You see the plates?" Garrett asked. "Partial. He's got a good memory, better than most. Gave me enough to confirm the vehicle type, the timeline, the behavior pattern. It fits." Garrett was quiet again. The kind of quiet that happened when a man was recalculating rather than just pausing. "What does he want?" Garrett asked finally. "In exchange for this information, for the ring, for any of it?" "Nothing," Jackson said. "I asked." He didn't negotiate, didn't angle, didn't try to position himself. He told me what he saw because I asked him a straight question and he gave me a straight answer. Everybody wants something. "He wanted breakfast," Jackson said. "He'd been running on a sandwich for 36 hours. Garrett looked at him for a long moment, Something moved across his face that was complicated and old and had nothing to do with the current situation. Specifically, it was more like a memory surfacing and then going back under. How old did you say he was? 20. Garrett nodded once slowly. Then he said, keep him in the building until we know more about Caldwell's next move. Don't let him wander. Then he turned and left without waiting for a response, which was Garrett's way of conceding a point while maintaining the outward appearance of having never conceded anything. Jackson turned back to his desk, one down. Across the building, Ethan was in the main space helping, without being asked, without making a production of it, stacked chairs that had been left out from the night before. Reeves noticed this, and Reeves noticed most things. He watched the kid work for a few minutes with the quiet assessment of a man who'd been responsible for the practical operations of this space for 11 years and had developed very specific opinions about who earned their place in it. You don't have to do that, Reeves had said. I know, Ethan said. He kept stacking. Nobody asked you to. I know that too. Ethan set down the last chair and looked at Reeves directly. I'm not good at sitting still when there's something that needs doing. If I'm in somebody's space, I want to contribute something. Reeves studied him. Where'd that come from? Ethan considered their question. My aunt originally, she had a saying, you don't earn your place by existing in it, you earn it every day by being useful. He paused. She was right about that, even when she wasn't right about much else. Reeves grunted. Then he said, there's a delivery coming this afternoon, food bank donations for the East Side distribution. I could use an extra set of hands sorting and loading. Ethan said, tell me where to be. That afternoon, Ethan worked alongside 4 members of the chapter for 3 hours sorting canned goods and dry staples and boxed food into organized categories, loading boxes, cross-referencing a handwritten inventory sheet that Reeves produced from his shirt pocket with the precision of a man who ran this operation the same way every time because the same way worked. Nobody talked much. There was a radio on somewhere turned low. The work was straightforward and physical, and Ethan fell into the rhythm of it, the way he fell into most physical work completely without dividing his attention. At one point, a man named Duke Large, quiet with the beard that had gone fully white and hands that looked like they'd been used professionally for decades, looked over at Ethan across a stack of boxes and said without preamble, you got family. No, Ethan said. Duke nodded as if this confirmed something he already understood. Where were you before the flat? Reno for a while. Before that Tonopah. Before that Elko. Ethan picked up a box. I was working my way in the wrong direction for a while. Duke almost smiled. You work in the wrong direction long enough, you end up back where you started. Yeah, Ethan said. I was trying to avoid that specifically. Duke looked at him with something that wasn't sympathy. It was more direct than sympathy. The thing about running, he said, is it only works until you've got somewhere worth stopping. Ethan didn't say anything to that, but he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, the chapter had its first real intelligence on Victor Caldwell's next move, and it came from a source nobody expected. A woman named Sandra Reyes called the clubhouse landline at 7:15 in the evening. Jackson took the call in his office with the door half open. Sandra Reyes was 73 years old and had lived in the same house on the east side for 41 years, and she'd been attending the community meetings since the first one the chapter had organized 14 months ago. She was also, as it turned out, the owner of a house that shared a back fence line with the property Caldwell's company used as a staging area for the development project. I'm calling because I saw something today, Sandra said, and I didn't know who else to call. Her voice had the careful steadiness of someone who decided to make a phone call they weren't entirely sure about and had committed to seeing it through. There were men here this afternoon, not construction workers dressed differently. They were walking through the alley behind my property and taking photographs of the houses on this side of the fence. I asked them what they were doing, and one of them told me they were doing a survey, an authorized survey. She paused. I've lived here 41 years. Nobody authorizes a survey of private property without notifying the residents first. I know that. You're absolutely right, Sandra, Jackson said. That's not a legitimate survey. I thought so. Another pause. There was something else. One of them, the one who spoke to me, he said something as he was walking away. Maybe he thought I was too far to hear. Maybe he didn't care. He said, and I'm telling you his exact words, because I went inside and wrote them down as soon as it happened. The old woman's the problem. Caldwell wants her moved before the vote. Jackson went very still. Sandra Reyes's property was the linchpin of the community opposition. Her lot sat at the corner of two properties that Caldwell needed to consolidate in order to make the development viable. Without her cooperation, the whole project had a structural gap in it that made the city council vote complicated, regardless of how many votes he'd bought. Jackson had known this for 8 months. Caldwell had known it longer. "Are you safe?" Jackson asked. "Are you alone right now?" "My son is here," Sandra said. "He came over when I told him." "Good, I need you to stay inside tonight. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know." His voice was level controlled because Sandra didn't need alarms, she needed a plan. "I'm going to have someone at your house by 9 o'clock. Someone you know from the meetings. They'll be there all night." There was a silence, and then Sandra said in a voice that was quieter than before and had something raw in it, "Jackson, I'm not afraid of Victor Caldwell." "I know you're not," Jackson said. "I am a little, on your behalf. That's not a bad thing." A pause, then quietly, "Thank you." Jackson hung up and stood in his office for exactly 4 seconds. Then he opened the door and said to the room in general, but specifically to Reeves, who was within earshot, "Get me Garrett and whoever's not on the food bank run tomorrow. Conference room, 20 minutes. Ethan was in the hallway just outside the office door, returning from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. He'd been bringing Jackson one every hour or so, without commenting on it the way someone did when they wanted to be useful but didn't want to intrude. He'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it. Jackson looked at him. "Sandra Reyes," Ethan said quietly, "the corner property." Jackson studied him for a moment. "You know about the project. You explained the council vote this morning. I paid attention." Jackson was quiet for 1 beat. Then, "Come to the meeting." The conference room held 7 people. 25 minutes later, Jackson, Garrett, Reeves, Duke, 2 men named Torres and Finch, who handled the chapter's community liaison work, and Ethan Parker, who sat in the chair nearest the door because he understood that he was there as an observer and wanted his position in the room to reflect that. Jackson laid it out in 12 sentences. Caldwell's team surveying Sandra's property without authorization. The comment the surveyor made. The timeline 6 weeks to the vote, and Caldwell was clearly shifting to a more aggressive approach now that the ring plan had failed. Garrett listened without interrupting, which was not his default setting. When Jackson finished, Garrett looked at the table for a moment and then said, "He's not going to go after her directly. Too visible. Too many people know her from the meetings." He paused. "He's going to find a pressure point." "Family?" Torres asked. "Or financial," Finch said. "Property tax, some kind of lien, something that creates a complication she'd have to resolve." He looked at Jackson. "You know her situation." "Better than Caldwell does," Jackson said. "She's clear on the property. Has been for 12 years. Her son has power of attorney, and he's not a soft target." He looked around the table. "What Caldwell's going to do is create a story that makes it easier for the council to vote his way regardless of the community opposition. He's done it before, not here, but in Reno and in Henderson. He finds the narrative that makes the opposition look unreasonable, and then he funds the counter-narrative long enough for the vote to happen. He had a narrative going with the ring," Duke said. "Until it came back," Jackson said. Every person in the room turned and looked at Ethan, not accusatorially, not with any particular weight of expectation, just with the natural convergence of attention that happened when the variable in an equation walked into the room on its own legs. Ethan looked back at them steadily. He'd been looked at in a lot of ways over the past 7 months, with suspicion, with dismissal, with the particular social invisibility that attached itself to people who appeared to be on the wrong side of a luck differential. This was different. This was people looking at him as something that factored, something that mattered to the outcome. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. He was sure he wasn't going to flinch from it. "If Caldwell's going to pivot the narrative toward me," Ethan said, and the room stayed quiet because he was speaking and they were listening, which was its own kind of significant, "then the question is whether I let him build that story without a counter or whether I put my version out first." He looked at Jackson. "You said I could tell my story in my own words. I've been thinking about what that means." "Tell me," Jackson said. "It means I don't wait for Caldwell to introduce me," Ethan said. "He's going to introduce me as a victim, some homeless kid who got taken in by a dangerous organization who's being used, who doesn't know better. That story works if nobody hears from me directly. It stops working the minute I stand up in a room and talk." Garrett looked at him. "You're 20 years old with no permanent address and a 7-month gap in your history." "Yes," Ethan said, "I am. And I found a ring worth $400 buried in the desert, and I walked 14 miles to give it back to a stranger. Those two things are both true at the same time. He met Garrett's eyes. Which story do you think people actually want to believe? The room was quiet. Garrett looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Ethan. Then Garrett said with the specific tone of a man updating his assessment without ceremony, "The kid's got a point." The planning that followed was meticulous, which was how Jackson Walker did everything. Torres and Finch knew the community meeting landscape, who came, who mattered, who represented which neighborhood, which council. Staff members attended informally. They worked through the logistics of the Thursday meeting with the organized efficiency of people who'd run these events before and knew exactly which details determined whether they worked. The question of Ethan's role was handled directly and without drama. He would attend. He would be introduced simply truthfully without theatrical setup as the person who had found and returned the ring. He would speak if he chose to. Nobody was going to script him. "I don't want a script," Ethan said when Jackson mentioned the option. "I didn't think you would," Jackson said. "But I want you to understand what you're walking into. There will be Caldwell's people in that room. They'll be there as community members, legitimate attendees, nothing you can point to. They'll be watching you, and they'll be reporting back." "Good," Ethan said. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Let them report back," Ethan said. "Let them tell Caldwell exactly what I said and exactly how I said it. The truth doesn't get more complicated when more people hear it." Jackson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You remind me of someone." Ethan waited, but Jackson didn't elaborate, and Ethan understood enough about the specific weight of that kind of statement to leave it alone. The next 5 days inside the chapter's building did something to Ethan that he didn't have immediate language for. It wasn't transformation. He was too careful about his own psychology for dramatic narratives about change. It was something quieter and more structural, like watching the foundation of a building that you'd been studying from the outside and realizing once you were inside that the load-bearing walls were in different places than you'd assumed. He'd come in expecting one thing and found another. He'd expected the chapter to be organized around fear, around the maintenance of reputation, the performance of intimidation. What he found instead was organized around obligation. These were men who owed each other things, who showed up for each other in ways that were specific and accountable. When Duke's truck broke down on Tuesday morning, 3 men were under it by noon without being asked. When a family from the east side called on Wednesday needing help moving out of an apartment that was being illegally locked by a landlord, 2 chapter members showed up with a truck within 2 hours. Ethan watched all of this. He helped where he could, doing what he was good at, the physical work, the logistics, the detailed attention that came naturally to him. He fixed a broken cabinet hinge in the kitchen on Monday afternoon without mentioning it to anyone, and nobody mentioned it to him. And somehow that silent exchange was the most normal thing that had happened to him in months. Reeves found him on Wednesday evening, sitting at one of the work tables in the back, repairing a section of fencing that had come loose from one of the outbuildings. Reeves pulled up a stool and sat down without preamble. "You know what's going to happen Thursday," Reeves said. "Not the meeting, after the meeting." Ethan looked up. "Tell me." "Caldwell's going to know you spoke. He's going to know who you are if he doesn't already. He's going to start building a file." Reeves said this matter-of-factly, the way a man described weather as information, not alarm. He's got people who do that kind of work. Background research, contact networks. He'll find out where you came from. He'll find out about your father. Ethan's hands paused on the fencing for exactly 1 beat, then continued. "He can find whatever there is to find," Ethan said. "What is there to find?" Reeves asked. Not nosily, directly, the way a man asked a direct question when the answer actually mattered. Ethan considered. He'd spent 7 months not talking about where he came from or why he'd left, and that habit of silence had calcified into something that felt structural. But Reeves was asking for a reason, and the reason was practical, and practical reasons deserved honest answers. "My father's name is Gerald Parker," Ethan said. "He runs a construction business in Henderson. Legitimate on the surface, but connected to some people who use construction contracts as a vehicle for other things. I don't have specifics. I was 19 when I figured out enough to know I needed to not know more. My father wanted me employed in the business. I said no." He paused. The people he's connected to made it clear that no wasn't a viable long-term position. Reeves was quiet. "So you ran," he said. "I relocated," Ethan said. With urgency, Reeves almost smiled. And your father, does he know where you are? He didn't until now, I'd guess. Ethan looked at Reeves directly. If Caldwell finds me and my father finds out through that, then we've got a second problem running parallel to the first one. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and said, I'll tell Jackson. Then he added as if it were a postscript, for what it's worth, the fact that you're telling me instead of hiding it, that's the right call. I've been making wrong calls by instinct for 7 months, Ethan said. I'm trying a different approach. Reeves left and Ethan went back to the fencing, and the building moved around him in its evening rhythms, and he thought about Gerald Parker for the first time in weeks. Not with fear, which was how he'd thought about him for most of the past 7 months, but with the cold, clear assessment of someone who'd gotten enough distance to see the shape of a person rather than just the danger they represented. His father was a man who mistook control for love and compliance for loyalty. He was also, Ethan now understood, a man who would be very uncomfortable having his son's name in a news story about a community meeting for reasons that had nothing to do with parental concern, which meant Gerald Parker was a variable in this situation the same way Caldwell was a variable. And variables needed to be tracked. He filed the thought and kept working. Thursday arrived with the particular flatness of a day. That matters, no dramatic weather, no special quality to the light, just an ordinary Nevada morning that happened to have something significant scheduled in it for the evening. The community meeting was at 6:30 at a church fellowship hall, about 2 miles from the chapter's building, and the preparation for it started early. Ethan had spent the previous evening with Torres and Finch going through the basics of the East Side Development Project, not because he needed to speak about it in detail, but because Jackson had said over coffee on Wednesday night that a person who understood what they were walking into was less likely to be caught off balance by whatever they found when they got there. There are going to be people in that room who haven't decided yet, Jackson had said. Not Caldwell's people, actual community members who are genuinely uncertain. People who've heard Caldwell's story and heard our story and haven't finished choosing between them. Those are the people who matter. What do they need to hear? Ethan had asked. They need to hear something true, Jackson said. Not persuasive, not strategic, just true. Because Caldwell gives them strategy every day, and they know what strategy sounds like. Ethan had thought about that for a long time before he slept. Now it was Thursday, and the chapter's building was operating at the controlled intensity frequency of a place where something important was about to happen. People moved purposefully, spoke concisely, and left out the social filler of a normal day. Ethan absorbed the energy and matched it, spending the morning hours doing practical preparation, loading, folding tables into a truck, confirming the PA system was working, picking up the printed materials that Torres had arranged at a copy shop. He was carrying a box of printed agendas from the truck when Garrett fell into step beside him, which was notable because Garrett had been, since Monday, maintaining a calibrated distance from Ethan that was not unfriendly, but was deliberate. You sleep last night? Garrett asked. Some, Ethan said. You nervous about tonight? Ethan thought about it honestly. Not nervous exactly. Aware. I know the difference between a situation I can control and one I can only navigate, and I'm trying to stay clear on which one this is. Garrett walked beside him for a few steps without responding. Then where'd you learn to think like that? 7 months of having nothing to fall back on, Ethan said. When you can't fix the situation, you get very good at managing your reaction to it. Garrett was quiet again. They were almost at the building entrance when he stopped and turned to face Ethan with the directness of a man who'd been working up to something and had decided to deliver it straight. I was hard on you when you got here, Garrett said. I want you to know that wasn't personal. It was protective. This chapter means something to me, and I'm careful about what comes near it. I know, Ethan said. I'd have done the same thing. Garrett looked at him. You ever think about what you're going to do after all this is over? After the vote, after Caldwell's dealt with? What's next for you? Ethan met his eyes. I've been working on that question, he said. I'm starting to think the answer might be somewhere in the vicinity of here. Garrett held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded a single slow nod that meant something, even if neither of them put words to what, and walked back toward the building. Ethan carried the box inside. 6 hours later, the fellowship hall was full. Not just attended full. More people than Torres had projected, more than the folding chairs could accommodate. And by 6:15, people were standing along the walls 3 deep. Ethan registered this as he came in through the side entrance with Jackson and Reeves, and he understood what the turnout meant. The word had spread. Whether through community networks or through whatever channels Caldwell used to monitor organized opposition, or simply through the organic propagation of a story that had caught on, word had spread, and the story of the ring was part of what had brought people out. He could see Caldwell's people immediately. They weren't subtle, not because they were careless, but because there was a specific quality that attached itself to people who attended a meeting as observers rather than participants, a watchfulness that set itself apart from the engaged attention of people who were there because they cared about the outcome. There were 4 of them distributed around the room, all with that particular stillness. Ethan noted their positions and turned his attention to the rest of the room. Sandra Reyes was in the front row between her son and a woman Ethan didn't recognize. She was a compact, upright woman with white hair and the bearing of someone who had decided decades ago that her spine was not decorative. When her eyes found Ethan across the room, she gave him a single direct nod as if they'd met before, as if she already knew what he was there for. He nodded back. Jackson opened the meeting without ceremony and without the kind of motivational preamble that inflated the beginning of these events and told an audience exactly how they were supposed to feel before they had heard any information. He laid out the situation, the development project, the council vote timeline, the community's legal position, the resources available. He spoke for 11 minutes and covered everything that needed covering, and when he was done, he introduced Torres, who handled the logistics and legal specifics, and then Finch, who talked about the network of community members who'd been engaged over the past 14 months. Then Jackson said, "I want to introduce someone who's new to this community, but who's already demonstrated something that I think everyone in this room needs to hear about directly." Ethan stood up. He'd thought about what he was going to say. Not scripted, he'd been clear about that, and Jackson had respected it. But he'd thought about the architecture of it, the sequence. The way you didn't lead with what happened, but with why it mattered. "My name is Ethan Parker," he said. "I'm 20 years old. 3 days ago, I was sleeping in a drainage culvert 14 miles outside this city because I'd been on my own for 7 months, and that was where I'd ended up." He spoke at a normal volume clearly without reaching for emotion. The emotion was in the facts, and he knew it. "I found something in the desert, a ring. I didn't know whose it was until I looked at it. Then I did some research and I figured it out. And instead of selling it, which it was worth enough to do, I gave it back." He paused. "I'm standing here tonight because giving it back turned out to matter to more than just the person it belonged to. I'm standing here because the people I gave it to are the same people who spent 14 months showing up for this community, and I saw in 3 days of being inside their building what showing up for people actually looks like from the inside." He looked around the room, not at Caldwell's observers, not at Jackson, but at the people standing along the walls, the people in the chairs, the people who'd come because they were uncertain and hadn't finished choosing. "Nobody told me to come here tonight. Nobody asked me to say anything. I came because the truth of what I know is more useful in this room than kept quiet." The room was very still. Then from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman said, "Why didn't you sell the ring?" Ethan found the voice of a middle-aged woman 3 rows back, looking at him with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Because it wasn't mine," he said, "and I know what it feels like when somebody takes something from you and acts like they have the right to it. I didn't want to be that person." The room held that. Then Sandra Reyes from the front row said in a voice that was clear and unhurried, "That's the answer." And the room understood what she meant, not just about the ring, but about the whole shape of what was happening in that hall, what the vote was about, what Caldwell's plan had been missing from the beginning. He'd been operating on the assumption that everyone had a price, that every person could be moved by enough pressure or enough money, that the people in this community were variables he could manage. He'd forgotten about the people who simply believed that something was theirs and that believing that mattered. After the meeting ended, after the conversations that went long past the scheduled close, after Sandra Reyes shook Ethan's hand with both of hers and told him quietly that she was glad the ring had found its way to him and not someone else. After the last of Caldwell's observers had melted away from their wall positions with their reports collected, Ethan stood outside in the parking lot with Jackson and felt the night air and the specific quality of silence that followed something significant. "Caldwell knows now," Ethan said. "He knew before tonight," Jackson said. "Now he knows what he's dealing with." "Which is what exactly?" Ethan asked. Jackson looked at him for a moment. Then, someone who isn't afraid of him, and someone who can make other people remember that they aren't either. The night air was warm and still, and the sound of people still talking inside the fellowship hall moved through the walls as a low, continuous hum. Ethan thought about what Caldwell was doing right now, what calls he was making, what plans he was revising, what new approach he was constructing. He thought about his father, who Reeves had told Jackson about, and about the additional layer that introduced. He thought about Sandra Reyes and her 41 years in one house, and her spine that was not decorative. He thought about the ring, about the decision he'd made in the gully, crouching in the dirt with $40 to his name and a piece of gold in his hand that could have changed everything. It had changed everything, just not the way he'd expected it to. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. Jackson put a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, a contact that lasted about 2 seconds, and communicated something that was better expressed that way than in words. "Now," Jackson said, "Caldwell makes his next move." He walked back toward the truck. Ethan stayed in the parking lot another moment. Somewhere across the city, a man with money and infrastructure and 3 years of careful planning was sitting with the information his observers had collected and understanding for the first time that the variable he'd failed to account for wasn't the ring. It was the person who'd returned it. Victor Caldwell made his next move on a Friday morning, 41 hours after the community meeting ended. Ethan knew it had happened before anyone told him because Jackson came into the main space at 7:50 with his phone in his hand and the specific quality of stillness around him that Ethan had already learned to read, and as controlled anger. Not hot anger, not reactive anger, but the cold structural kind that happened when someone did exactly what you predicted they would and you were still furious about it anyway. Jackson set his phone on the table face up and looked at Ethan. "He moved faster than I expected," Jackson said. The phone displayed a news article. Local outlet published 40 minutes ago. The headline read, "Community Advocate Raises Concerns About Hells Angels Influence at East Side Meetings." The byline belonged to a reporter Ethan didn't know. The article quoted extensively a man identified as a longtime community development professional named Victor Caldwell, who expressed deep concern about the involvement of a known motorcycle club in shaping community opinion on a major development project. The article described the Thursday meeting. It described in vague but pointed terms the presence of a young transient individual who had been brought in to speak on the organization's behalf. It did not name Ethan. It didn't need to. "He's framing it," Ethan said. "He's been framing it since before we sat down Thursday night," Jackson said. "He had this ready. The meeting gave him the hook to run it." Garrett was reading over Ethan's shoulder, and Ethan could feel the particular energy that came off Garrett when his threat assessment instincts were running at full capacity, a dense, focused attention that excluded everything outside the immediate problem. "Who's the reporter?" Garrett asked. "Melissa Cho. She's covered the development beat for 2 years. She's not Caldwell's. She's just doing her job with the information he gave her." Jackson picked up his phone. "Which means she'll do her job with better information if we give it to her." "You want to talk to a reporter?" Garrett said. It wasn't quite skepticism. It was more like a man testing the weight of an idea before committing to it. "I want Ethan to talk to a reporter," Jackson said. The room adjusted. Ethan felt the weight of every set of eyes in the space shifting toward him, not all at once, but in that sequential way where each person reached their own conclusion about where the relevant attention should be directed. Ethan looked at the phone, at the phrase "young transient individual," sitting in the middle of a paragraph that was factually accurate about everything except what it implied. "Set it up," Ethan said. Melissa Cho arrived at the chapter's building at 10:15. She came alone with a notebook and a voice recorder, and she walked in with the professional composure of a woman who had interviewed people in unfamiliar settings many times before and had learned that composure was the most useful thing she could bring into a room. She was maybe 32, with the kind of watchful eyes that Ethan associated with people who listen for a living. Jackson met her at the door, shook her hand, and brought her to the conference room. He sat her down and said, "I'm going to step out and let you talk to the person you actually should have been talking to before this morning's article ran." Then he stepped out, and Ethan sat across from Melissa Cho, and she looked at him with her recorder on the table between them and her notebook open and said, "Tell me who you are," Ethan told her. "Not everything. Not the pieces that were his alone to carry, not the specifics of Gerald Parker and Henderson. and the reasons he'd left that he wasn't ready to put into a news article, but the relevant truth, the true truth, the version that actually described what had happened. He told her about 7 months on his own. He told her about the gully and the ring and the decision he'd made sitting in the dirt. He told her about walking to the truck stop to use the Wi-Fi. He told her about hitching part of the way here and walking the rest. He told her about Jackson offering him a room and a meal with nothing owed, and about what the 3 days inside this building had actually looked like, and about Thursday night's meeting, and about why he'd spoken. Melissa Cho wrote steadily, asked clean questions, and never once used the phrase young transient individual. When Ethan finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Then she looked up and said, "Victor Caldwell is going to say you were coached." "I know," Ethan said. "What do you say to that?" "I say coached to say what? That I found a ring and gave it back, that I made a decision by myself in a desert with nobody watching. Coaching implies someone told me what to do. Nobody told me anything. I told myself." Melissa looked at him steadily. "You're 20 years old." "Yes." "You've been homeless for 7 months." "Yes." "And you think people are going to believe you weren't manipulated?" Ethan met her eyes. "I think people are going to believe whatever the truth sounds like when they hear it. And I think most people know on some level what truth sounds like versus what a managed story sounds like." He paused. "Do you a beat?" Then Melissa Cho almost smiled very briefly in the way journalists smiled when an interviewee said something that confirmed a hypothesis they'd come in with. She wrote something in her notebook and clicked off her recorder. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to need to reach out to Caldwell's office for a comment." "That's your job," Ethan said. "Do it." She left. Jackson came back in and looked at Ethan across the table. "How'd it go?" he asked. "She's good at her job," Ethan said, "which means the article will be accurate." "Accurate is all we need," Jackson said. The accurate article ran at 4:30 that afternoon under the headline, "The Ring the Runaway and the Question of Who's Really Shaping Eastside Opinions." It was 11 paragraphs long, and it quoted Ethan directly 6 times. It included in the 8th paragraph a comment from Caldwell's office spokesperson that described the chapter's involvement as concerning and their use of a vulnerable young man as ethically questionable. The comment, sitting next to Ethan's actual words in Melissa Cho's actual sentences, did not have the effect Caldwell's office had presumably intended. By 6 o'clock that evening, the article had been shared 1,400 times. By 8 o'clock, it was the most read story on the outlet's website. By 10 o'clock, Ethan's phone, a prepaid one that Reeves had quietly provided him on Tuesday, no ceremony, just handed it over and said, for the week, was receiving messages from people he didn't know, which meant the number had somehow migrated out of the article's comment section into actual circulation, which meant something was happening that was larger than a local news story. He sat on the edge of his bed in the back room and looked at the phone. Reeves appeared in the doorway. "You should see the main room," he said. The main room had a television on and about 15 men gathered around it, not in the attentive silence of people watching something they'd planned to watch, but in the alert, incremental stillness of people watching something develop in real time. A local news broadcast. The anchor was talking about the East Side Development Project, and then the banner at the bottom of the screen changed, and the anchor said the words "community response," and the camera cut to footage from outside the fellowship hall from Thursday night, and Ethan saw himself walking in through the side entrance, captured from a distance by someone with a phone. The footage was 12 seconds long and completely unremarkable, but it existed, and it was on television. Duke turned and looked at Ethan from across the room. "Well," he said, "you're famous." "I'm not famous," Ethan said immediately. "You're on TV," Duke said. "That's different." "Tell that to the TV," Duke said, and looked back at the screen. Jackson was on his phone in the corner, and Ethan could tell from the pace and compression of Jackson's speech that this call was significant. He caught Ethan's eye across the room and held up one finger 5 minutes. Ethan nodded and went to the kitchen to get coffee because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room being looked at by people who were trying to be respectful about not looking at him. He was pouring when Torres appeared at his elbow. "I need to tell you something," Torres said in the specific voice of someone who'd been waiting for a private moment. "And I need to tell you straight." "Tell me," Ethan said. "Someone called the community hotline this afternoon before the article ran. They identified themselves as a representative of Gerald Parker's construction company in Henderson. He paused, watching Ethan's face. They said Gerald Parker had seen the news and wanted to know where his son was. Ethan's hand was still on the coffee pot. His father had been an abstraction for 7 months, a reason to keep moving and a pressure applied from a distance, a shape in his peripheral vision that he'd successfully kept from becoming a direct confrontation by virtue of never stopping long enough in one place. He'd expected this possibility. He'd told Reeves about it. He'd thought about it clearly and filed it in the correct compartment. The compartment was apparently not as sealed as he'd believed. "What did you tell them?" Ethan asked. "Nothing," Torres said. "I ended the call and told Jackson." Ethan set the coffee pot down. "Gerald Parker doesn't want to know where I am because he's worried about me," he said. The words came out flat without emotion because they weren't an emotional statement. They were a factual assessment. "He wants to know where I am because I'm a liability right now. My name in the news creates exposure for him." Torres nodded slowly. "That's what Jackson figured. Which means he's going to try to reach me through other channels. Or show up." Ethan thought for a moment. "Or connect with Caldwell." Torres went very still. "You think they know each other?" "I think," Ethan said carefully, "that men with money and construction interests and a need to make problems disappear tend to know each other. It's not a large world." He picked up his coffee. "I think we need to find out." He took the coffee to Jackson, who had just ended his call, and was standing with his phone in his hand looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man assembling a structure in his head. "My father made contact," Ethan said. Jackson looked at him. "Torres told me. How are you?" "Fine," Ethan said. Then, because he was trying a different approach, worried but managing it. Jackson nodded. He appreciated the honest revision. "Your father and Caldwell, do you have any reason to think there's a connection?" "Reason to suspect, not reason to confirm." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Do you have the resources to find out quickly?" Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know people who know things, yes." "Then we need to know tonight," Ethan said. "Because if Caldwell reaches my father before we understand that connection, we're dealing with something coordinated instead of two separate problems." Jackson made one phone call. 12 minutes later, he had what he needed and what he had changed the shape of everything. Gerald Parker's construction company had received 2 contracts from a Caldwell-affiliated development LLC in the past 18 months, combined value at approximately $400,000. The contracts were documented, legitimate, and publicly filed, not hidden, not secret, just unexamined by anyone who hadn't been looking for them. Jackson came to find Ethan and told him directly because that was the kind of man Jackson was. Ethan sat with it for about 30 seconds. "So my father is financially connected to the man who's trying to destroy this community's opposition to a development project," Ethan said. "And my father is now trying to locate me. On the same day that Caldwell learns I spoke at a community meeting and gave an interview to a reporter." He paused. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Jackson said, "it's not." "Which means my father calling the hotline wasn't about me," Ethan said. "It was about Caldwell." "That's my read," Jackson said. "Caldwell knows who you are now. He found the connection to your father, and he's using your father to locate you because locating you is the first step in whatever he's planning to do about you." Ethan was quiet for a moment, not afraid or not purely afraid, because fear in isolation was useless. More like recalibrating, taking in the new shape of the situation and adjusting his understanding of where the pressure points were. "What does he want to do about me?" Ethan asked. "A few options," Jackson said. He ticked them off with the directness of someone who wasn't going to soften a threat assessment because softening it would be less useful than clarity. "He pressures you through your father, financial leverage, family pressure, whatever Gerald Parker brings to the table. He discredits you through your history, 7 months on the road, whatever your father says about why you left. Or he tries to get you to recant, say you were coached, say you misrepresented things, give him something that unravels the article." Ethan looked at him. "None of those work." "None of them work," Jackson agreed. "But they don't have to work completely. They just have to create enough noise to muddy the water before the vote." And then the door at the front of the building opened, and Garrett came in from the parking lot with his jaw set and his phone in his hand, and he looked across the room at Jackson and said, "We've got a situation." The situation was outside. Not a confrontation, Nothing violent, nothing that broke any law. Just a man in a business suit standing on the public sidewalk adjacent to the parking lot, with a driver waiting in a white truck nearby, looking at the building with the unhurried patience of someone who had decided to be somewhere and was going to stay there until the decision accomplished something. He's been there for 10 minutes, Garrett said. Didn't approach the building, didn't say anything to anyone, but just standing there. Who is he? Reeves asked. I don't know, Garrett said, but the truck is registered to Caldwell Properties, LLC. Ethan walked to the window and looked. The man on the sidewalk was not Victor Caldwell. Ethan had seen a photo of Caldwell now, and this wasn't him. This was someone younger, mid-30s, with the suit and patience combination that said lawyer or fixer rather than developer. He wasn't looking at the window, he was looking at his phone. But he was there, visibly, deliberately there. It's a message, Ethan said. What kind of message? Reeves asked. The kind that says, we know where you are. We know what you're doing. We're watching. Ethan turned from the window. It's designed to make us reactive, make us do something that looks defensive or aggressive. Jackson was watching him. You sound like you've thought about this kind of tactic before. My father used it, Ethan said simply. Not this exactly, but the principle. You don't threaten directly, you create the atmosphere of a threat. Let the other person's imagination do the work. The room was quiet. Then Garrett said unexpectedly, so we don't react. We don't react, Ethan confirmed. We go about our evening. We don't send anyone out. We don't make any calls they can intercept. We just exist normally and let the man stand on the sidewalk until he gets tired. Jackson looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the window. Fine, Garrett said. Somebody put more coffee on. The man in the suit stood on the sidewalk for another 45 minutes and then got into the truck and drove away. Nobody from the chapter went out to confront him. Nobody called anyone in a way that created a trail. They ate dinner someone had made chilly enough for 20, and there were 20 people to eat it, and the building remained what it was, a functioning space full of people going about their evening. Ethan ate 2 bowls of chili and helped wash up afterward, and then went back to the conference room because he needed to think, and the conference room was where thinking happened. He sat alone for about 20 minutes. Then Duke came in, pulled up a chair across from him, and sat down with his coffee cup held in both hands and said, Tell me what's going on in your head. Ethan looked at him. Duke was the kind of man who asked questions he actually wanted answered, which was rarer than it should have been. I'm trying to figure out the sequence, Ethan said. Caldwell's next move, not the lawyer on the sidewalk that was theater. The real next move. What are the options? Duke asked. He goes through my father, uses the financial leverage to put pressure on me through someone who knows me. Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. Or he goes public with my history. Homeless, estranged from family, no fixed address. Tries to establish that I'm not a credible voice. Either of those scare you? Duke asked. Ethan considered it honestly. The father angle has more teeth, he said. Not because my father can actually control me. He couldn't even when I was living under his roof. But because it's unpredictable. My father doesn't operate according to a plan the way Caldwell does. He operates according to anger and ego, and those are harder to anticipate. Duke nodded slowly. What about the credibility angle? That one's easier, Ethan said, because the story about who I am is already out there in Melissa Cho's words. You can't successfully argue someone is incredible after they've already been credible in public. He paused. The window for that closed this afternoon. Duke looked at him for a long moment. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Tell me. I keep thinking about what kind of 20-year-old sits in a room with people twice his age and thinks through threat sequences like he's been doing it for decades. Duke set his coffee down. Where does that come from? Ethan was quiet for a moment. You spend enough time being the smallest person in a room full of people who have more power than you, he said. You learn to think several moves ahead. It's not intelligence, it's survival math. Duke looked at him with something deep and old moving through his expression. I had a son, he said. He would have been about your age. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The past tense carried its own specific weight, and Ethan understood to leave it exactly where Duke had set it down. I'm sorry, Ethan said. Duke nodded, then he picked up his coffee. Jackson's going to want to strategize first thing in the morning. You should sleep if you can. Ethan slept. He was surprised each time that he could that the accumulation of threats and variables and moving pieces that lived in his head between nightfall and sleep was something he could set down cleanly enough to actually rest. But he could. He'd learned to over 7 months because not sleeping made every problem worse, and he'd needed his mind functional. He woke at 6:15 to the sound of his prepaid phone buzzing on the nightstand. Unknown number. He stared at it for 2 buzzes, then he answered. Ethan. His father's voice after 7 months hit him in a specific place, not the chest, not the gut, but somewhere in the back of the head, some pre-rational part of the brain that responded to parental voices according to rules that the rest of the brain had revised completely but hadn't fully communicated downward. I've been looking for you. Ethan sat up. His voice when it came out was steady. Dad, he said, you need to come home. Gerald Parker's voice had its usual layered quality surface concern laid over bedrock authority, and underneath both of those something that Ethan had only recently learned to identify correctly: fear. Not of Ethan, of what Ethan being out in the world represented to Gerald Parker's very carefully constructed life. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. I understand it pretty well, Ethan said. These people are dangerous, Gerald said. I don't care what that article said. You're 20 years old and you've been on your own for 7 months and someone got to you, Ethan. Someone used you. Nobody used me, Ethan said. I made a decision by myself in the middle of a desert with no one watching. The same way you taught me decisions got made based on what was right. A pause. Don't do that. Don't do what? Don't use my words back at me right now. This isn't a philosophical conversation. No, Ethan agreed. It's a practical one. You're calling me because Victor Caldwell asked you to, or told you to, because I'm a problem in Caldwell's timeline, and he thinks you can manage me. Ethan kept his voice level. Not cold, he didn't feel cold. He felt something more complicated, the specific ache of a relationship that had never been what it should have been, and now never would be. How much did he pay you, Dad, for the contracts? Was it enough for this call to feel reasonable to you? The silence that followed was different from the pauses before it. This one had weight in it, the weight of a man who had been found out and was now deciding what to do with that. You don't know what you're talking about, Gerald Parker said finally. I know about the contracts, Ethan said. I know about the development LLC. I know the timeline. He paused. I also know that whatever Caldwell promised you, it's conditional on the council vote going his way. And I know that I am currently the primary obstacle between Caldwell and that vote going the way he needs it to. Another pause. So I'm going to need you to be very careful about what you say to me right now, because this call is going to be relevant to a lot of things in the next 6 weeks. Gerald Parker said nothing. Come home, he said finally, but the authority was gone from it now. It was just the words sitting there without their structure. I am home, Ethan said. I just found it in an unexpected place. He ended the call. He sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room for a moment with the phone in his hand. His hands were steady. He checked because it seemed like the kind of moment where hands might not be, but they were. He went and found Jackson. Jackson was already up, already on his second coffee, already in the conference room with Garrett and Torres, and a whiteboard covered with notes. He looked at Ethan when Ethan came in and read something in Ethan's face before Ethan said a single word. Your father called, Jackson said. Yes, now, 6:15. Ethan sat down. He made the call Caldwell needed him to make. I told him I knew about the contracts. He didn't deny them. Jackson put his coffee down. Garrett said slowly, you told him you knew about the contracts. Yes. Which means Caldwell is going to know within the hour that we know about the contracts, Garrett said. Yes, Ethan said again. Garrett looked at Jackson. The look was complicated. It was the look of a man who had arrived at the same conclusion from 2 different directions and was reconciling the routes. That either panics him into a mistake, Garrett said, or it accelerates whatever he was planning to do next. It accelerates it, Ethan said with certainty. He's not the kind of man who panics. He's the kind of man who moves up his timeline when the situation changes. Which gives us how long, Torres asked. Days, Ethan said. Not weeks. Jackson stood up. He went to the whiteboard and picked up a marker and wrote a single word at the top of a blank section, Caldwell. Then under it, 3 lines, contracts, community vote, Sandra. He circled Sandra's name. She's still the linchpin, Jackson said. Everything else, the ring, the article, the public narrative, all of it shifts the political pressure, changes the story. But the development project doesn't work without her property. Caldwell knows that. He's always known it. He turned to face the room. We've been focused on the community meeting, the press, the vote count. Caldwell's going to pivot. He's going to go directly at Sandra. The room went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happened when everyone in a room arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. We need to move faster, Garrett said. We need to contact the other property owners on that block, Torres said. The ones who haven't committed yet. If we can consolidate the opposition before Caldwell makes his move on Sandra, we can make his position untenable at the council level, Finch finished. Jackson nodded. He was already moving. Already allocating Garrett on the property owner contacts, Torres on the council staff relationships, Finch on the legal resources they'd need if Caldwell created a financial complication for Sandra. He moved through the assignments with the efficiency of a man who ran a large and complicated operation and did it well. Then he looked at Ethan. You, he said, are going to do something harder than any of that. Ethan waited. You're going to Sandra's house, Jackson said, today, and you're going to tell her what we know what's coming and what her options are. Directly. From you. He held Ethan's gaze. Not because you're the right tactical choice, because she trusts you. She shook your hand Thursday night, and she meant it, and she's going to need to hear this from someone she believes. Ethan thought about Sandra Reyes in the front row, about the nod she'd given him across the fellowship hall before he'd known her name, about her spine that was not decorative. When do I go? Ethan asked. After breakfast, Jackson said. Ethan nodded and stood up. As he headed for the door, Garrett said behind him, without preamble or build-up, the way Garrett said everything. You handled your father right. Ethan paused in the doorway. He didn't turn around because he didn't think Garrett wanted him to. Some acknowledgments were better received facing the same direction. Thank you, Ethan said. Then he went to get breakfast. Sandra Reyes lived in a house that felt like 41 years from the outside, not run down, not neglected, but settled the way things settled when someone had been tending them with consistent care across decades. She opened the door before Ethan knocked because she'd been watching from the window, which she told him immediately with the directness of a woman who saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I saw you come up the walk, she said. You move like someone who's been sleeping outside. You check your perimeter first. Old habit, Ethan said. Come in, she said. I have coffee. She had more than coffee. She had coffee and a table and a kind of attentiveness that made Ethan understand within about 45 seconds of sitting down why her name was at the center of every whiteboard in this situation. Sandra Reyes was the kind of person who made other people feel that what they were saying was worth saying. It was a specific quality, and it wasn't common, and it was probably the most dangerous thing she possessed as far as Victor Caldwell was concerned. Ethan told her what they knew. All of it, the contracts his father's call the white truck, the surveyor's comment about the old woman. He told her the way Jackson had told him things directly without managing her reaction, trusting her to handle accurate information the way she clearly handled everything else. Sandra listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the middle of the table for a moment. Then she said, he's going to try to file something, some kind of legal complication against the property. He's been building toward it for a while. I had a surveyor knock on my door in April, someone I didn't call, and a letter from a company I'd never heard of in May about an alleged easement dispute from 1987. I filed it. She paused. I think I still have it. Ethan stared at her. You have documentation of his approach. I have 3 letters, she said calmly. I kept everything because my husband, God rest him, always said paper was your friend and throwing it away was your enemy. Sandra, Ethan said, and he could hear in his own voice something that was very close to relief. We need those letters today. She nodded as if this was the most reasonable request anyone had ever made. I'll get them after we finish the coffee. Ethan called Jackson from Sandra's front porch while Sandra went to find her files. Jackson listened to what he said and was quiet for a moment, and then said in a tone that was not quite disbelief and not quite satisfaction, but something vibrating between them. She kept the letters. 3 of them, Ethan said, starting in April. That's 8 months of documented approach, Jackson said. If we can get those to the right people before Caldwell files anything, We flipped the narrative completely, Ethan said. He's not the concerned community member opposing a dangerous motorcycle club. He's been running a systematic pressure campaign against a 73-year-old woman for 8 months. Jackson said, "Get the letters and get back here. We're going to need Finch on the phone within the hour." Ethan went back inside and Sandra was already at the table with a manila folder that was organized the way only a person who'd spent 41 years believing paper was their friend could organize a folder chronologically with dates written on the outside of each document in blue ballpoint, clear and deliberate. She handed it to him. "Young man," she said as he took it. He looked up. "You're scared," she said, not asking, observing the way she observed things accurately and without cruelty. "A little," he said. "Yes." "Good," Sandra said. "People who aren't scared don't take things seriously enough." She looked at him steadily. "But I want you to understand something. That folder you're holding, those are 8 months of a man trying to make me feel alone, trying to make me feel like one person can't hold a line." She paused. "You found a ring in the desert and walked 14 miles to give it back to a stranger. Don't tell me you don't know how to hold a line." Ethan looked at her. He thought about the gully and the ring and the decision that had seemed so simple when he made it in the silence of the desert with no one watching. He thought about what it meant that the simplest decision he had ever made had led him here to this table in this house, holding a folder that might be the piece that changed everything. "I know how to hold a line," he said. Sandra nodded once. "Then go," she said. "I'll be here when you need me." He went. And across the city, Victor Caldwell was already on the phone with his lawyer, accelerating his timeline. Unaware that the 20-year-old he'd planned to use as a piece in his strategy had just walked out of a 73-year-old woman's house holding 8 months of his own documented moves. The endgame had started, but it wasn't going the way Caldwell had built it. Finch had the letters scanned and in front of a real estate attorney named Carla Mendez by noon. Carla Mendez was 51 years old, had been practicing property law in Nevada for 22 years, and had a reputation in the legal community for 2 specific things. She didn't lose easement cases, and she didn't take phone calls from developers without charging them for the privilege. Jackson had worked with her twice before on community property disputes, and both times she'd told him exactly what she thought without softening it, which was the only quality he required from a lawyer. She called back 47 minutes after Finch sent the documents. "These letters are a problem for Caldwell," she said without preamble. "Not because they're illegal in isolation, a company can send letters about alleged easement disputes, but the timing, the sequence, and the fact that none of them were ever filed in any county record tells me what they actually are." "Which is what?" Jackson asked. He had the phone on speaker in the conference room. Ethan, Garrett Torres, and Finch were all present, and nobody was pretending not to listen. "Harassment with legal formatting," Carla said. "The easement he references in the May letter doesn't exist in the county records I checked while you were on hold. There was never a registered easement dispute on that property from 1987 or any other year. He fabricated a legal claim, formatted it to look official, and sent it to a 73-year-old woman 3 times over 8 months." Oh, pause, Twam. "That's not legal maneuvering, that's intimidation." "Can we use it?" Jackson asked. "Depends on what you mean by use," Carla said. "If you mean file a complaint, yes, and I'd win it, but it takes time we don't have before the council vote. If you mean use it as leverage in the public conversation, that's not my department, but I'd say the letters speak for themselves loudly enough that they don't need a lawyer to interpret them." "What about the council vote?" Ethan asked. There was a brief pause on the line, Carla registering a new voice recalibrating. "Who's that?" "Ethan Parker," Jackson said. "He's the one who got the letters." "The ring kid." "Kid," Carla said in a tone that was neither dismissive nor sentimental, but simply accurate. "Good question. The vote is a political process, not a legal one, so the letters don't block it directly. But council members are elected people who read local news and don't enjoy being on the wrong side of an old woman being intimidated by a corporation. If those letters become public before the vote, at least 2 of the undecided council members are going to have a much more difficult time explaining a yes vote." "How do they become public?" Ethan asked. "That," Carla said, "is also not my department." She hung up. The room sat with what she'd given them for about 10 seconds. Then Garrett said, "Melissa Cho." Torres was already pulling out his phone. Melissa Cho arrived at the chapter's building for the second time in 2 days, and this time she didn't look like someone maintaining professional composure in an unfamiliar setting. She looked like a reporter who'd just been handed something significant and was working hard not to show how significant she thought it was, because showing it too early sometimes made sources nervous. She sat at the conference table and read all 3 letters twice without speaking. Then she looked up. "These are fabricated," she said. "The easement doesn't exist in county records," Finch said. "We have documentation." Melissa looked at the letters again. Then she looked at Ethan specifically with a direct focus of someone making a decision about a source. "I'm going to need Sandra Reyes to confirm she received these." In her own words. "She's expecting your call," Ethan said. "She said to tell you she wrote down the date she received each one because her husband always said, 'Paper is your friend,'" Melissa finished. She almost smiled. "I talked to her Thursday. She told me the same thing." She gathered the letters, carefully treating them with the specific respect journalists gave to physical documents that were going to matter. "Give me 4 hours." She left. Garrett looked at the door after it closed. "She's good," he said, which from Garrett was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "She is," Jackson agreed. He turned to the room. 4 hours, which means we use the time. Torres, the undecided property owners. Where are we? Torres pulled out his notebook. There were 4 property owners on the east side block who hadn't formally committed to the community opposition. 2 were elderly couples who'd attended 1 meeting and then gone quiet. 1 was a single man in his 40s who'd told Torres 2 weeks ago that he was waiting to see how things developed. 1 was a rental property owner who lived in Arizona and managed the property remotely, the hardest to reach, the most likely to respond to a financial argument. By 2 in the afternoon, Torres had spoken to 3 of the 4. Both elderly couples committed within 30 minutes of a phone call that described the fabricated easement letters in plain language. The man in his 40s, his name was Patrick, and he had a dry, careful way of speaking that suggested a person who made decisions slowly and held them firmly, said he needed to see the documentation himself. Torres drove it to him directly. The Arizona property owner didn't answer. Jackson left a message. At 2:45, Ethan's prepaid phone buzzed. Not an unknown number this time. Torres had added Sandra's number to the contact list after the morning visit, and it was Sandra's name on the screen. He answered immediately. "Victor Caldwell just filed something with the county," Sandra said. Her voice was calm, but with the specific kind of calm that existed on top of something that was not calm. "My son got a call from a friend who works in the county recorder's office. They filed a formal easement claim this morning, before your lawyer looked at the letters." Ethan processed this in 1 second. He knew we had the letters. "He must have," Sandra said. He accelerated. "He filed officially before we could use the informal letters against him, because once there's a formal filing, the letters become a side issue." Ethan was already moving toward the conference room. "Are you okay?" "I'm annoyed," Sandra said. "There's a difference." "Yes, there is," Ethan said. "Hold on." He walked into the conference room and said without preamble, "Caldwell filed this morning, formal easement claim with the county. He moved before we could leverage the letters publicly." The room absorbed this in one collective beat of silence. Then Carla Mendez's earlier words came back, the one thing she'd said that now carried new weight: "I'd win it, but it takes time we don't have before the council vote." "He doesn't need to win the filing," Garrett said slowly, working it out. "He just needs it to create a legal complication that clouds Sandra's ownership status long enough for the council vote to happen. If her property is under active legal dispute, the council can argue the community opposition isn't as consolidated as we've claimed." "Can he do that?" Torres asked. "Create a fake legal cloud over her property?" "He just did," Ethan said. Jackson was very still. He had his hands flat on the table, and his eyes were moving in the particular way they moved when he was constructing something, laying out pieces, testing configurations, finding the line of attack that addressed the actual problem rather than its surface. "Carla," he said. "Calling her now," Finch said. Carla's reaction to the news was a single word that Ethan wouldn't have expected from a lawyer, followed by 11 seconds of silence, followed by, "Okay, here's what we do. I file a motion to dismiss based on the absence of any recorded easement in the county's own history. That should be straightforward, but it takes 3 to 5 business days minimum to process." "The vote is in 5 weeks," Jackson said. "Then we have time for the legal route," Carla said. "But I want those letters published before I file. I want the public record of his intimidation established before his fake filing gets to define the story. Can your press contact move faster than 4 hours?" I'll ask, Jackson said. He called Melissa Cho. Melissa Cho, as it turned out, had been about to call him. I just verified the letters with Sandra, she said. I'm writing now, but I need you to know something. A pause, Mom. I got a call 20 minutes ago from Caldwell's communications director. They told me they're planning to release a statement this afternoon about the formal easement filing. They're going to frame it as a legitimate legal action to protect development rights against organized resistance. Another pause. They also mentioned Ethan by name. They said they have information suggesting he has a personal reason to want to damage Victor Caldwell's business interests related to his family's construction background. The room, which had been listening on speaker, went very quiet. Ethan felt something move through him that was cold and specific, not fear, but recognition. His father had given Caldwell something, not proof of anything because there was nothing to prove, but narrative material, a suggestion of a motive that could be laid alongside his public statements and used to contaminate them. What family construction background? Garrett said quietly, looking at Ethan. My father's company received contracts from Caldwell's LLC, Ethan said. I told you that. We found out together. He looked around the room. Caldwell is going to flip it. Instead of using the contract connection to show my father is compromised, he's going to use it to suggest I'm compromised, that I have some personal grievance against Caldwell because of my father's business relationship. That makes no sense, Torres said. It doesn't have to make sense, Ethan said. It just has to create doubt. It just has to give people a reason to wonder whether I'm who I said I am. He could hear his own voice, steady, analytical, the part of him that had learned to think through situations instead of react to them, and underneath it, something older and more tired that recognized this specific tactic from a specific source. My father is doing for Caldwell exactly what he always wanted me to do for him, managing the situation, making the problem go away. Jackson looked at him. You need to get ahead of this. I know, Ethan said, right now, before Caldwell's statement drops. I know, Ethan said again. He looked at the phone on the table. Melissa was still on the line listening. Melissa, he said. I'm here, she said. I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told anyone publicly yet, Ethan said. And I need you to include it in your article because if Caldwell's going to use my father's business connections as a weapon, the only thing that stops it from working is if I tell the story myself before he tells his version. A pause. I'm listening, Melissa said. Ethan took a breath. He told her about Gerald Parker, about Henderson and the construction business, and the people connected to it in the night he'd understood enough to know he couldn't stay. He didn't editorialize. He didn't dramatize. He told it the way he'd learned to tell hard things factually, in sequence, letting the facts carry their own weight. When he finished, Melissa was quiet for a moment. You understand what you're doing, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm removing the weapon, Ethan said. If I tell it, it's my story. If he tells it, it's his. There's going to be a response from your father, Melissa said. I know. And it won't be comfortable. Very little that's true is comfortable, Ethan said. That doesn't make it less true. Another pause. Then, give me 2 hours, Melissa said. I'm combining everything, the letters, the easement, filing your statement. One article. I'll send it to you before it publishes. She hung up. The room was quiet. Duke, who had come in somewhere in the middle of all of it and settled into his chair with the unobtrusive presence of a man who took up space without demanding it, said, How do you feel? Ethan sat with the question for a real moment before answering. Like I just stepped off a ledge, he said. But the falling part hasn't started yet. Duke nodded. Sometimes it doesn't, he said. Sometimes you just land. The 2 hours that followed were the most operationally dense Ethan had experienced since arriving at the chapter, and that was saying something given the week. Torres reached the Arizona property owner. His name was Devin, and he had exactly the kind of response to hearing about the fabricated easement letters that Torres had predicted. 3 minutes of tightly controlled outrage, followed by an immediate commitment to the community opposition, which he formalized in writing within the hour and emailed to Torres's phone while they were still on the call. That was all 4 undecided property owners committed. Finch got that information to Carla Mendez, who added it to the motion to dismiss documentation she was building because a unified community opposition with 0 uncommitted property owners was a different legal argument than a fragmented one. Garrett spent 45 minutes on the phone with 3 people whose names Ethan didn't catch. And when he came back into the conference room, he said to Jackson, Council member Diane Tran has been looking for a reason to vote against Caldwell's project. She's been under donor pressure from two people with direct financial ties to his development, LLC, and she's been managing that pressure by staying publicly uncommitted. When she sees this article, she'll have a reason that's bigger than the donor pressure, Jackson said. That's my read, Garrett said. And if Tran votes no, Caldwell needs a clean sweep of the remaining undecideds to hit the threshold he needs, which he's not going to get. Jackson absorbed this. We're not there yet, he said. The article isn't published. The motion isn't filed. Nothing is done until it's done. I know, Garrett said, but we're closer than we were this morning. Jackson looked at Ethan. How are you holding up? Ethan thought about it. Ask me again after the article. The article published at 4:18 in the afternoon. Ethan read it on the prepaid phone sitting alone in the back room for exactly the amount of time it took to get through all the 14 paragraphs. Melissa Cho had done something that surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. She'd structured the piece so that his statement about his father came in the middle, grounded by the established facts of the Ring story, and the letter so that it read not as a dramatic revelation, but as the logical next piece of a coherent account. His words, his phrasing, his sequence. She hadn't touched the substance of what he'd said, only organized it. He read the paragraph about his father twice. Then he put the phone down, sat with his hands in his lap, and spent approximately 3 minutes doing nothing at all. Just breathing, just letting the fact of it settle, the fact that what had been private was now public, that the story he'd been carrying alone for 7 months was now in 14 paragraphs on a local news website, that Gerald Parker was going to read it, that people who knew Gerald Parker were going to read it, that the specific small world of Henderson, Nevada construction was going to spend tomorrow morning talking about it. He picked up the phone and texted Melissa one word. Thank you. She texted back. You did that, I just organized it. He put the phone in his pocket and went to find the rest of the chapter. The main room was operating at a different frequency than it had been running all week. Not celebration because nothing was concluded, but the specific release of tension that came when a sequence of things that needed to happen had happened, and the people who'd been working toward them could let their shoulders drop an inch. Coffee was being poured. Someone had produced sandwiches from somewhere. The television was on, but nobody was watching it with the anxious attention of before. When Ethan came in, Reeves looked up from what he was doing and said without anything performative in it, "Good article." Several of the men nearest him nodded the kind of nods that communicated things that were better not put into sentences. Ethan sat down and ate a sandwich and drank a coffee and let the room be around him, which was something he was still learning how to do, how to be in a space with people without feeling like an imposition, without calibrating his presence against an imagined threshold of acceptability. He was still learning it, but he was learning it faster here than he'd learned most things. His phone buzzed at 5:40. Unknown number, different unknown number than his father had used. He answered, "Mr. Parker." The voice was measured professional and had the specific flatness of someone who made difficult calls for a living. "My name is Thomas Reed. I'm Victor Caldwell's attorney." Ethan was very still. "Okay," he said. "Mr. Caldwell asked me to reach out to you directly," Thomas Reed said. "He'd like to propose a conversation. Just him, you, and counsel, if you prefer. He believes there may be some misunderstandings about the nature of the development project and about certain communications that were made to Ms. Reyes, and he'd like the opportunity to clarify those misunderstandings directly." Ethan looked across the room at Jackson, who was watching him with the alert stillness of a man who couldn't hear the other side of the call, but could read Ethan's face well enough to understand the shape of it. "Mr. Reed," Ethan said, "what time was this article published?" A brief pause. "I'm sorry. The article in the Evening Tribune, about the easement letters. What time did it publish?" Another pause shorter. "I'm not sure I see the relevance." 4:18, Ethan said. "It's now 5:40, which means it's been public for 1 hour and 22 minutes. And Mr. Caldwell is calling me within 90 minutes of publication." He kept his voice level. "Tell me what misunderstanding Mr. Caldwell would like to clarify." Thomas Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, with the tone of a man adjusting his approach, "Mr. Caldwell is prepared to discuss a number of things, including the future of the development project, including certain contractual arrangements that have been mentioned in public reporting. The contracts with my father's company," Ethan said, "among other matters." "I see," Ethan said. He thought for exactly 3 seconds. Mr. Reed, I appreciate the call. Tell Mr. Caldwell that if he has something to say to me, he can say it at the next community meeting. Thursday, same fellowship hall, 7 o'clock. A pause. If he'd like to clarify misunderstandings, he can do that in the same room where his representative told Sandra Reyes she was the problem. Thomas Reed said nothing for a moment. I'll pass that along, he said, and his voice had taken on the careful neutrality of a man who had not expected this specific response and was not going to reveal that he hadn't. Thank you, Ethan said, and ended the call. Jackson was beside him in 4 steps. Caldwell's lawyer, he asked. Wanted a private meeting, Ethan said. I told him Thursday, the community meeting. Jackson looked at him for a moment. You think he'll come? No, Ethan said, but now the question of whether he comes is public, or it will be when I tell Melissa Cho about the call. Jackson held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that Ethan couldn't fully categorize. It was part assessment, part something older and more personal. The look of a man who was revising an understanding he hadn't known needed revising. I need to tell you something, Jackson said. Come with me. They went to Jackson's office, and Jackson closed the door, which he only did when something needed the room to be smaller. He sat behind his desk, and Ethan sat across from it, and for a moment Jackson just looked at his hands, both flat on the desk, the way he did when he was about to say something that required getting the phrasing right. I told you, you reminded me of someone, Jackson said. Last week, I didn't explain. You didn't have to, Ethan said. I want to, Jackson said. He looked up. My son, his name was Marcus. He died 6 years ago, not violently, not dramatically. Just an accident, the kind that happens when a 23-year-old is driving tired on a night shift. He was working 3 jobs. A pause. He was 23 and working 3 jobs because he was that kind of person. He wanted to contribute. He wanted to be useful. He couldn't sit still when there was something that needed doing. He held Ethan's gaze steadily. You reminded me of him the first morning when I heard you'd been stacking chairs without being asked. The room was very quiet. Ethan felt the weight of what Jackson had just handed him, not as a burden, but as the thing it actually was. Trust. This most functional kind of trust, the kind that came without conditions or performance requirements. I'm sorry about Marcus, Ethan said. So am I, Jackson said, every day. He picked up his coffee, held it, set it back down. I'm not telling you this because I want you to be a replacement for something I lost. I'm telling you because I've been running this chapter for 20 years, and I know the difference between someone passing through and someone who's found their place. And I think you deserve to know what I see when I look at you. He paused. Which is someone who found their place. Ethan looked at the desk between them. He thought about 7 months of movement of Reno, and Tonopah, and Elko, and the flat of culverts, and dumpsters, and Darlene's paper bags, $43 in a coffee tin. He thought about the ring in the dirt and the decision he'd made when no one was watching. He thought about the specific gravity of this building, this room, these people, how something had been pulling him into orbit from the moment he'd walked across that gravel lot, and how he'd been trying to name the force of it ever since. I don't know how to have a place, he said. It came out quiet and honest and a little raw. I've been moving for so long that staying feels like something I have to learn. It is something you have to learn, Jackson said. That's not a problem. That's just what's next. They sat with that for a moment. Then Jackson said, the easement motion gets filed tomorrow morning. Carla's ready. Oh, my wife. The council vote is 5 weeks out, and our position just got significantly stronger. He picked up his coffee again. But Caldwell's not done. The call from his lawyer tells me he's shifting strategy, not retreating. What does your gut tell you he does next? Ethan was grateful for the practical pivot. He thought about Caldwell the way he'd been thinking about him all week, as a structure rather than a person, a set of resources and constraints and characteristic responses. He can't come to Thursday's meeting, Ethan said. That's a concession frame. It looks like he's responding to community pressure, which validates the opposition. He won't do it. Agreed, Jackson said. He's going to try to make the letters into something else, Ethan said. Reframe them as legitimate legal notices that got characterized incorrectly. He'll bring in someone, probably not his own lawyers because they're too close to it. An outside voice, someone who can present as a neutral expert who'll say the easement claim was procedurally sound. He paused. He needs to introduce doubt about the letters before Carla's motion makes them the centerpiece of the legal record. Jackson was watching him. He's going to do it publicly, Ethan said. Press statement or a prepared quote to a reporter. And he's going to do it in the next 24 hours before the motion files. Jackson nodded slowly. If he does, we need to be ready with Carla on the record. Counter statement, same timeline. Can she do that? For this case, Jackson almost smiled. She'd do it for free. He picked up his phone and started dialing. Ethan left the office and walked back into the main room. And the building was doing its evening thing around him, people settling the volume, adjusting to a later hour, the kitchen producing smells that suggested someone had started something that would be ready in an hour. The ordinary rhythms of a place that had been through a difficult week and was still standing. Reeves appeared at his elbow. You eat anything real today? Sandwich, Ethan said. Half a sandwich, Reeves corrected. I saw you put down the other half when Torres came in with the Arizona news. Ethan almost laughed. You track what people eat. I track what people need, Reeves Bartik said. It's basically the same thing. He steered Ethan toward the kitchen by the simple method of walking in that direction and assuming Ethan would follow, which Ethan did. Sit down, 40 minutes. I should be in there when Caldwell's statement comes out. You'll be in there in 40 minutes, Reeves said, with food in you. Jackson's got Carla on the phone and Garrett's watching the news feeds. Nothing's going to change in the next 40 minutes that requires you specifically. He put a bowl down in front of Ethan. Soup, real soup, the kind that had been going for hours. Eat. Ethan ate. And something about sitting in the kitchen with Reeves moving around, doing the practical quiet work of maintaining the space, washing a pan, checking on something in the oven, restocking the coffee did something to the tension that had been running through Ethan's chest all day. Not releasing it exactly, more like redistributing it, making it something he was carrying rather than something that was carrying him. Reeves, Ethan said. Reeves looked up from what he was doing. When I came here, Ethan said, that first day, Jackson offered me a room before he knew anything about the truck, before he knew about my father, before any of this, just because I returned the ring. He paused. Why did he do that? Reeves was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding between several true answers and trying to identify which one was most true. Jackson's done 3 versions of what you did, he finally said. Different situations, different stakes. When he was 17, when he was 26, when he was 32. 3 times in his life, he had something that wasn't his and returned it when returning it cost him something. He looked at Ethan steadily. He knows exactly what that decision looks like from the inside, and he knows the person who makes it. Ethan looked at his soup. He recognized you, Reeves said. That's the whole answer. Caldwell's statement came out at 7:40 while Ethan was in the main room, and Carla Mendez was already on a 3-way call with Jackson and a reporter from a competing news outlet who'd reached out to her directly after reading the Tribune article. The statement was exactly what Ethan had predicted, a carefully worded document describing the easement letters as standard preliminary legal communications in a complex property rights matter, and characterizing the reporting as a coordinated campaign by a motorcycle organization to interfere with legitimate development. It quoted an outside real estate consultant who described the easement claim as procedurally common. It did not address the fact that the specific easement referenced in the letters had no basis in the county's recorded history. Carla addressed that fact in 4 sentences on the record in the competing outlet's article that published 30 minutes later. She also noted in a 5th sentence that she would be filing a motion to dismiss the formal claim first thing in the morning with full documentation attached. The chapter's main room was quiet for a moment after Torres read both articles aloud. Then Garrett said, "He's running out of moves." "He has money," Jackson said. "People with money don't run out of moves. They just change what the moves cost." "What does that mean for the vote?" Torres asked. "It means we keep working," Jackson said. "Every day until the vote, we keep working. We keep showing up for the people on that block. We keep being present, invisible, and accountable." He looked around the room. "We don't let him make this about us versus him. We keep it about the community. That's always been the stronger's position, and it still is." The room absorbed this and recalibrated, and people began moving back into their separate tasks, the kind of organic redistribution of energy that happened when a large group of people all understood the next thing they needed to do. Ethan found himself standing near the window, where 2 days ago he'd watched Caldwell's lawyer stand on the sidewalk like a planted flag. The sidewalk was empty now. The night was ordinary. The building was full of people doing the work that needed doing. Duke materialized beside him, which was Duke's preferred mode of appearing without announcement, without the social preamble that most people used to establish their arrival. "You called Caldwell's play on the statement," Duke said, "before it came out?" "Pattern recognition," Ethan said. "It's what he had left that he could do quickly. And you knew it." "I've been thinking about how he thinks all week." Ethan looked at the window rather than at Duke. When you spend enough time inside someone's logic, you start to see the exits before they use them. Duke was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think," he said. Ethan waited. "I think the ring wasn't what changed your life," Duke said. "I think your life was already who you were. The ring just put you somewhere it could matter." Ethan turned that over for a moment. He thought about the gully and the dirt and the decision. He thought about what Reeves had said, that Jackson recognized him. He thought about the chain of events that a single private unwitnessed choice had set in motion, and how none of it would have happened if he'd been a different person in that gully. "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe," Duke said. He clapped one large hand once on Ethan's shoulder, brief, solid, a contact that communicated something that didn't need language. Then he walked away. The chapter's building went quiet around midnight, winding down from a week that had run at an intensity most weeks didn't approach. The legal motion would file in the morning. The Thursday community meeting was 4 days away. The council vote was 5 weeks out. Ethan lay on his bed in the back room and looked at the ceiling and ran through the sequence of the past 10 days the way you ran through a route you were going to have to navigate again, not dwelling, just mapping. The gully and the ring and the decision, the gravel lot and the door and Jackson's question, the article and the letters and his father's voice on the phone at 6:15, Sandra's folder and Carla's motion and Melissa Cho's 14 paragraphs. And underneath all of it, something that had been shifting so gradually that he hadn't had language for it until Duke said it, until Jackson said what he'd said about Marcus, until Reeves said Jackson recognized you. He wasn't a runaway anymore. He'd understood that intellectually for days. But there was a difference between understanding something and feeling the absence of its opposite, the absence of the constant low-frequency noise of having nowhere to be, of belonging to no particular square of ground, of being the kind of person the world moved past without registering. That noise had been running so long he'd stopped hearing it as noise and started hearing it as silence. It wasn't silence. He understood that now. It was just the sound of someone being alone. What he was living in now, in this building with these people, was the actual silence, the quiet that came from not having to brace for anything, from knowing that the space you occupied was one you'd earned by being who you were, rather than by hiding what you were. He fell asleep before he finished the thought. And in the morning, Carla Mendez filed the motion, and the fight for the East Side began its last chapter. Carla Mendez's motion hit the county recorder's office at 8:52 in the morning, and by 9:15, Thomas Reed had called her personal line. Carla let it go to voicemail. She called Jackson instead. "He's rattled," she said. "Reed doesn't call opposing counsel directly unless his client told him to, and Caldwell doesn't make that call unless the motion does something he didn't expect it to do." She paused. "The documentation we attached, the full county record search, showing zero evidence of the easement going back 60 years, that's what rattled him. He fabricated a claim, and now the fabrication is in a public legal filing." "What does he do about it?" Jackson asked. "He has two options," Carla said. "He withdraws the easement claim voluntarily, which is a public capitulation, and it poisons his credibility with the council before the vote. Or he fights the motion, which means a hearing, which means the fabrication gets examined in an official proceeding with reporters present." She let that sit for a moment. There's no version of this that ends well for him. The question is, which version ends worse? "Which one buys him time?" Jackson asked. "Fighting it," Carla said. "A hearing takes 3 to 4 weeks to schedule. If he can push it past the council vote..." "He doesn't need the easement to be real," Jackson said. "He just needs it to be unresolved." "Exactly." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Can you force a faster hearing?" "I can argue expedited consideration given the proximity to a material public vote," Carla said. "It's a stretch, but it's not an absurd stretch. The judge would have to agree." Another pause. "There's also a second option, something cleaner." Tell me. The council doesn't have to wait for the legal question to be resolved, Carla said. The council can vote based on the record that exists right now, including the fabricated claim and our motion, and make their own assessment of Caldwell's credibility. A smart council member, Diane Tran, Jackson said, Pompey could enter the motion and the county record's documentation into the public comment record at the vote, Carla said, which means the legal question becomes part of the political record whether or not the hearing has happened. Jackson's voice shifted into the register it reached when pieces were connecting, which means Caldwell's legal delay tactic doesn't protect him from the vote. It just makes him look like he's delaying, Carla confirmed. Get me the expedited hearing request filed by end of day, Jackson said, and send me the documentation in a format Diane Tran can enter into public record. It'll be in your inbox by 3, Carla said. She hung up. Jackson turned to the room where Garrett, Torres, Finch, Reeves, and Ethan were all present and had been listening to every word. We just changed the geometry, Garrett said. We changed one side of it, Jackson said. The legal side. Caldwell still has money, and he still has 4 weeks, and he still has the donor pressure on at least 3 council members. He looked at Torres. Where are we on the council count? Torres had a notebook, and the notebook had a page that had been updated 3 times in the past week, and the page showed a grid that Torres could read faster than most people read text. Confirmed no 2, confirmed yes 3, leaning no Tran and Carver. Undecided 2, Caldwell's committed yes 2. He needs 5 to pass, Jackson said. He has 3 committed and 2 he's probably buying, Torres said. He needs 1 more from the undecided column, or he needs to flip a leaning no. Tran's the leaning no with the most donor pressure on her, Finch said. Tran's also the one who can enter the documentation into public record, Jackson said. He looked at Ethan. You haven't said anything. Ethan had been running something through his head since Carla described the geometry, and he'd been waiting until it was fully formed before he said it out loud, because half-formed thoughts in a room full of people who acted quickly were the fastest way to create a problem in the wrong direction. Caldwell's donor pressure on Tran, Ethan said. Is it direct personal contribution to her campaign, or is it routed through a PAC or a bundler? Torres looked at his notebook. 2 donors, 1 direct contribution, 1 through a business PAC. So it's visible, Ethan said. Publicly filed, yes, Torres said. Then Tran already knows we can see it, Ethan said. Which means the pressure she's under isn't just from the donors, it's from the visibility of the pressure. If she votes yes, people will connect it to the money. She knows that. He looked at Jackson. She's not looking for permission to vote no. She's looking for cover, something that makes the no vote look principled rather than just anti-Caldwell. The room was quiet for a beat. The documentation Carla's sending, Garrett said slowly. If Tran enters it into the public record herself. She's the principled council member who exposed a fabricated legal claim, Ethan said. Not the one who caved to a motorcycle club's community pressure. Not the one who crossed her donors out of stubbornness. He paused. She gets to be the person who did the right thing because the evidence demanded it. Garrett looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Ethan for a long moment with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether a thought was as good as it sounded or whether it had a flaw he hadn't found yet. We need to get that framing to Tran directly, Jackson said. Not through a press intermediary, not through the community network. Directly. I can make that call, Torres said. Make it now, Jackson said. Torres was on his phone before he left the room. The day moved fast. It moved the way days moved when a sequence of things was happening, and each thing created the next thing without gaps. No waiting. No dead air. Just the continuous forward motion of a situation that had developed enough momentum to carry itself. Torres reached Tran's chief of staff at 10:15. The chief of staff, a practical woman named Bridget, who had the political instincts of someone who'd been in that office through 3 election cycles, listened to what Torres said, and then asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said she'd call back within the hour. She called back in 40 minutes. Diane Tran would enter Carla's documentation into the public record at the council vote. She would do it in the context of raising a question about the integrity of the approval process given the active legal dispute. She would not explicitly endorse the community opposition or the chapter's position. She would simply and publicly and on the record ask whether the council was comfortable voting on a project whose primary advocate had filed a legally contested easement claim based on county records that showed no such easement existed. It was, as Bridget put it, a question any responsible council member should ask. Torres came back into the conference room and read this out from his notes, and the room processed it in the specific silence of people who recognized a decisive shift when they encountered one. "That's the vote," Garrett said. "That's the beginning of winning the vote," Jackson said. "It's not the vote yet." But something had loosened in the room, some structural tension that had been load-bearing for the past 10 days. Not gone too much was still unresolved for it to be gone, but redistributed the way a weight shifted when you found a better grip on it. Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His father. He stared at it for 2 full rings. Then he stepped out into the hallway and answered. "Ethan," Gerald Parker said. His voice was different from the call 3 days ago. Thinner somehow. Like the authority had been decanted out of it, and what remained was just the man underneath. "I read the article." Ethan didn't say anything. "You told them about the business," Gerald said. "About the contracts." "I told them about me," Ethan said. "The contracts were context." "That's..." Gerald started, then stopped. Started again. "That's my livelihood, Ethan. You understand that what you put in that article with my name in it?" "What I put in that article was true," Ethan said. His voice was not unkind. It was not cold either. It was something in between that he hadn't had language for before this week, but that he now understood was what honesty actually sounded like when it wasn't performing. "Everything I said was true. You have contracts with a man who has been running a fabricated legal intimidation campaign against a 73-year-old woman. That's true. You called me to help him manage the situation. That's true. I didn't characterize you beyond what's true." Gerald's was quiet. "I didn't call you a criminal," Ethan said. "I didn't call you a bad person. I said what happened." He paused. "What happens with your business after this depends on you, on what you do now, on whether you keep working for a man whose methods are going to be in a lot more articles before this is over." Gerald's voice, when it came back, had something in it that Ethan hadn't heard from his father in years, possibly ever, a quality of genuine uncertainty. "Are you okay?" Gerald said. "I mean, are you actually okay where you are with these people?" The question landed differently than Ethan expected. He'd anticipated another angle of approach, more pressure, a different argument. Not this. "Yeah, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm actually okay for the first time in a while." A long silence. "I didn't know how to do this right," Gerald said. Not an apology, but the kind of statement that lived in the same territory as one. "With you, I don't think I knew how." "I know," Ethan said. Another silence. Longer. "I'll think about the contracts," Gerald said. It wasn't a commitment. Ethan knew it wasn't a commitment, and he didn't need it to be. It was a crack in a wall that had been sealed for 20 years, and cracks were what they were beginnings, not conclusions. "That's all I'm asking," Ethan said. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in his hand, and the specific weight of that conversation settling through him. Then he went back into the conference room and told Jackson about it factually the way he told Jackson everything. Jackson listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Jackson said, "How do you feel about that?" Ethan thought about it carefully. "Like something got put down that I'd been carrying without knowing I was carrying it," he said. "Not resolved, but put down." Jackson nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's what you get," he said. "Not resolution, just a different way to carry it." The Thursday community meeting arrived with the same ordinary morning quality as the vote day had. Just a Thursday, just a regular city day, except that what happened in the next 8 hours was going to determine whether the thing they'd all been working toward held or fell apart at the last moment. Caldwell did not come to the meeting. His absence was in its own way a statement, the statement of a man who understood that showing up was a concession he couldn't afford, and that not showing up was the only form of control he had left over the room. He sent Thomas Reed instead, which was its own kind of statement, the kind that said, "I acknowledge this meeting exists, but I will not dignify it with my personal presence." Thomas Reed sat in the back row alone, with a leather portfolio on his lap, and did not speak for the first 40 minutes of the meeting. Those 40 minutes were the most organized, most substantive, most densely attended community meeting the chapter had run in 14 months. 320 people in a fellowship hall designed for 200. Sandra Reyes in the front row. All four of the formerly undecided property owners present seated together in what had clearly been a planned configuration, a visible unified front. Council member Diane Tran's chief of staff, Bridget, seated midway back, attending in an official capacity. Ethan sat to Jackson's left, not behind him, not deferred to the sides. Left. Jackson opened the meeting the same way he always opened it, without performance, without motivational scaffolding, just the facts in their correct sequence. The development project, the timeline, the legal motion, Carla's documentation, Diane Tran's commitment to enter it into the public record, the community's unified opposition, all four property owners' formal commitments. He said all of this in 14 minutes. Then he said, "We have someone who wants to speak. You've heard from him before, but what he's going to say tonight is different from what he said last week because the situation is different." Ethan. Ethan stood up. He'd thought about this longer than he'd thought about the last time. Not what to say, that part was clear, but how to say it in a way that matched the room, that met the people in it where they actually were, rather than where a strategy needed them to be. "A lot has happened since last Thursday," he said. "Most of you have read the articles. You know about the letters. You know about the easement claim and why it doesn't hold up in the county records." He paused. "What I want to talk about is something different. I want to talk about what it takes to stay." The room was quiet. "I've been moving for 7 months," Ethan said. "Running, if I'm being honest. And the thing about running is it teaches you a lot about what you're leaving, but it doesn't teach you much about what you're going to. I ended up here by accident, by a ring in a ditch, in a decision that nobody made me make." He looked around the room. Not at the cameras that Melissa Cho had arranged to be present tonight, not at Thomas Reed in the back row, but at the people in the chairs. The people standing along the walls, the people who had come because they were still in the process of deciding something about their own lives. "Victor Caldwell is betting that you'll leave. Not physically, he knows you're not going anywhere overnight, but that you'll get tired, that the pressure and the legal complications and the uncertainty will wear you down until the idea of staying and fighting costs more than the idea of letting it go." Someone in the middle of the room said quietly, "It already costs a lot." Ethan found the voice. A man in his 60s, work-worn, with the look of someone who'd been in the same house for decades and felt the weight of that in his body. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't. What I'm going to tell you is what I've learned in the last 10 days inside this building with these people. Staying costs something, but it builds something too. Every meeting you show up to, every letter you keep, every phone call you make to a neighbor who's on the fence, all of that is construction. Slow construction. You're building something that Caldwell can't buy because it isn't for sale." The room held that. Then Sandra Reyes from the front row, without turning around, said in her clear and unhurried voice, "He's right." And the man who'd spoken after a moment nodded, just once, but completely. That was the moment the room shifted. Ethan felt it not as a theatrical event, not as a dramatic turn, just as the quiet, decisive change in a space's collective energy, when people stop calculating and start committing. Thomas Reed in the back row wrote something in his portfolio. He left quietly 20 minutes before the meeting ended, and nobody commented on his departure because nobody needed to. The meeting ran long past 9:30 into the hour when most meetings would have dissolved into milling and departures. People stayed. They talked. They made plans, specific, actionable plans, not the kind that sounded good in a public forum and dissolved by the following Tuesday, but the kind where people exchanged phone numbers and agreed to specific tasks and made specific commitments about who would call whom before the council vote. When the last of them finally filed out past 10 o'clock, the fellowship hall had the particular resonance of a space where something had been decided. Jackson stood with Ethan in the mostly empty room, while Reeves and Torres and Finch stacked chairs and gathered materials, and he looked at the space and said simply, "That's what it's supposed to feel like." "I didn't know what it was supposed to feel like," Ethan said. "Now you do," Jackson said. The council vote happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 4 days after Carla's motion was filed. Ethan was there. The whole chapter was there, or the portion of it that could attend a public meeting without the size of the group becoming a story in itself. 12 men in their vests in the public gallery, seated and quiet and present in the specific way that communicated seriousness without threat. Sandra Reyes was there with her son in the second row. The four formerly undecided property owners were there. Diane Tran was at this council table, and when the development project came up on the agenda, she did exactly what Bridget had said she would do. She entered Carla's documentation into the public record, read 2 sentences of the county record search into the minutes, and said quietly and precisely and on the record, "I think this council needs to ask itself whether we're comfortable approving a major development project when the primary advocate for that project is currently defending a motion to dismiss a claim they filed that our own county records indicate has no factual basis." The room was not as dramatic as Ethan had imagined it might be. It was a council chamber on a Tuesday morning with fluorescent lighting and a full public gallery in the procedural cadence of official municipal business. The drama was in the content, not the form. Caldwell was present. He sat in the first row of the public gallery with Thomas Reed beside him, and for the first time Ethan saw him in person, a man in his mid-60s, well-dressed, with the contained energy of someone who was accustomed to rooms going the way he needed them to go. Ethan watched him listen to Tran's statement, watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, watched him write something on a notepad that Thomas Reed looked at, and then looked back at the council table with an expression that said the note confirmed something neither of them wanted confirmed. The vote ran 40 minutes after Tran's statement through the public comment period where 14 community members spoke, 2 of them from the property owner's block. One of them, Sandra Reyes, who said 7 sentences in the clear and unhurried voice she brought to everything, and whose 7 sentences contained more concentrated truth than most people delivered in 7 minutes. 6, number 3, yes, 1 abstention. The development project in its current form was rejected. The council chamber did not erupt. There was applause from the gallery, real sustained applause, the kind that came from people who had been working toward something and had arrived at it. But it was not chaos. It was relief. The sound of people exhaling something they had been holding. Ethan sat in the gallery and felt the vote land and didn't do anything dramatic about it because there was nothing dramatic to do. He just sat with it, let it be what it was. Jackson beside him put one hand briefly on his shoulder, the same way he'd done in the parking lot after the first community meeting, the gesture that communicated things better than sentences could. Caldwell left the chamber without speaking to anyone. Thomas Reed followed. The door closed behind them. Torres leaned forward from the row behind and said quietly in Ethan's ear, "We won." "We held," Ethan said. "That's the same thing." What followed the vote was not a single moment, but a sequence of weeks, and what happened across those weeks was quieter and slower and more permanent than anything that had happened in the chamber. Carla's motion to dismiss was granted 17 days after the vote. The fabricated easement claim was formally struck from the county record. The documentation of the original intimidation letters was attached to the dismissal order and became part of the public legal record, which meant that the pattern of behavior was now archived in a way that would follow any future project Caldwell brought to any county in the state. He didn't disappear. Men with money and infrastructure rarely disappeared, but he recalibrated the way people recalibrated when the cost of a specific approach proved higher than the return. The East Side Development Project was eventually reformulated by a different developer, one who engaged the community from the beginning, which was not a fairy tale ending, but was a real one. Sandra Reyes called Ethan on the Thursday after the vote. She called to tell him that her son had fixed the fence panel along the back property line that had been coming loose since spring, which had nothing to do with Caldwell or the vote or the chapter, and which was exactly why she mentioned it. "Things go back to normal," she said. "That's the point. That's what we were protecting. Normal." "I'm starting to understand normal," Ethan said. "It takes practice," she said, "like anything worth having." Gerald Parker called 10 days after the vote. He didn't mention the vote. He didn't mention Caldwell. He said he'd been thinking about what Ethan had said, that what happened next depended on what Gerald did now, and he said he'd ended the contracts with Caldwell's LLC. He said it the way he said everything, without ceremony, without apology, as a discrete event, just as information delivered and registered. Ethan said he was glad to hear it. Gerald said he'd like to talk more sometime. Not soon necessarily, just sometime. Ethan said okay. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't the kind of father-son conversation that resolved 20 years of accumulated damage in a single call. But it was a door that had been sealed and opening a crack, and Ethan understood enough now to know that cracks were what they were, the beginning of light coming through, not the light itself. He put the phone down and thought about what it meant that he could be glad without being naive about it, that he could hold something complicated without needing it to be simple. That was new. That was something this building had given him, not the capacity for it, which had always been there, but the space to practice it, the room to be complicated without being alone in the complication. The chapter had a formal gathering 6 weeks after the vote, not a celebration because Jackson didn't organize celebrations, but what he called a debrief, which was his way of acknowledging that something significant had happened and the people who'd made it happen deserved to sit in the same room and know it together. 42 people. The full chapter plus Sandra Reyes and her son, plus Torres's wife who had been running the community phone tree for 3 months, plus Melissa Cho who came without her recorder and sat in the back and ate the food someone had made and didn't write a word. Ethan was at the table near the window where he'd first sat and eaten breakfast the morning after he arrived 7 weeks ago. Reeves put a plate down in front of him without being asked the same way he had that first morning. Ethan looked at the plate and then looked up at Reeves and said, "Thank you." Reeves said, "You've said that before." "I mean it more each time," Ethan said. Reeves sat down across from him, which he'd never done before. He was usually in motion, usually managing something in the operational center of this building in constant quiet rotation. But he sat down now and picked up a cup of coffee and looked at Ethan with the directness he brought to everything. "What's next for you?" he asked. Ethan had been asked this before. By Garrett in the parking lot after the first meeting. By Duke in the conference room. He'd given versions of an answer each time. But the answer had kept changing, kept getting clearer, the way things got clearer when you'd had enough time to see them properly. "I want to stay," Ethan said, "if there's a place here." Reeves looked at him for a moment. "There's been a place here since the second morning when you fixed the cabinet hinge without telling anyone." Ethan almost laughed. "I didn't think anyone noticed that." "I notice everything," Reeves said. "I told you." Across the room, Jackson was talking to Sandra. Reyes and Garrett was in an argument with Torres about something that involved a lot of hand gestures, and almost certainly had nothing to do with the vote or Caldwell or anything that had consumed the past 6 weeks. Duke was eating with the focused attention of a man who took food seriously. The woman who ran the kitchen was moving between conversations with the practiced efficiency of someone who kept this specific ecosystem running and knew it. The room was full and warm and loud in the way rooms were loud when people were comfortable with each other. Overlapping conversations, laughter that didn't need to explain itself, the ordinary beautiful noise of people who trusted the space they were in. Ethan sat in the middle of it. He thought about the gully, about the ring in his palm and the weight of it and the decision he'd made in the silence of the desert with nobody watching and nothing to gain and everything he needed on the other side of a different choice. He thought about what it had felt like to make that decision, not noble, not dramatic, not even particularly difficult in the way he'd expected it to be. Just clear. The kind of clarity that came when you knew who you were well enough that the right thing and the instinctive thing were the same thing. He'd been running from his life for 7 months. He'd walked 14 miles to give back a ring. And the version of himself that had made that walk hungry, tired, uncertain, carrying nothing but the instinct that doing the right thing mattered, even when nobody was watching, that version had led him directly here. To this table, to this room, to these people. Jackson crossed the room and sat down across from Ethan the way he'd sat down that first morning, with coffee between them and questions being asked and everything still unresolved. He looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him then, the same assessment, the same weight of attention. But the assessment had a different answer now because the information was different. "You talked to Reeves," Jackson said. "He asked what was next," Ethan said. "What did you tell him?" "That I want to stay." Jackson looked at him steadily, not considering he'd already considered this. The considering had happened weeks ago. Ethan suspected possibly as early as that first morning when a 20-year-old who'd been sleeping in a culvert fixed a cabinet hinge without being asked and without saying a word about it. "You know what you're taking on," Jackson said. "It's not glamorous. It's not always dramatic. Most of it is logistics and phone calls and showing up on a Tuesday when nothing significant is happening and doing the work anyway." "I know," Ethan said, "and you want that." "I want what it builds," Ethan said. "I've seen what it builds." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he said rarely to few people with the weight of a man who understood that some statements needed to be made precisely or not at all. This chapter is better because you walked across that gravel lot. Ethan held that. Not deflecting it, he'd learned that deflecting genuine things was a habit he'd built out of 7 months of managing expectation, and it was a habit worth breaking. He held it and let it be true and let it matter. I'm better, Ethan said, because of what was on the other side of the door. Jackson nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out at the room at the 42 people, talking and arguing and laughing and eating at Sandra Reyes, telling Torres's wife something that was making the woman laugh so hard she had to set down her cup at Melissa Cho in the back, with a smile she probably didn't know was visible from across the room at Garrett, making a point to Duke that Duke was clearly not conceding and wasn't going to. You know what the ring taught me, Jackson said. Not a question, more like a man completing a thought that had been running for weeks. It taught me that the things we lose have a way of coming back when they're supposed to. Sometimes in different forms. Sometimes through people you never expected. Ethan looked at the ring on Jackson's hand back where it had always belonged, back from the dirt and the distance and the planning of a man who tried to use its absence as a weapon. It found its way home, Ethan said. So did you, Jackson said. The room moved around them. The food ran low and someone went to get more. Garrett finally conceded Duke's point visibly and reluctantly, which made 2 people nearby stop their conversation just to witness the rarity of it. Sandra Reyes caught Ethan's eye across the room and gave him the same nod she'd given him across the fellowship hall that first Thursday. Direct, complete the nod of a woman who didn't waste gestures on things she didn't mean. Ethan nodded back. He sat at the table in the warm room in the building that had become the truest place he'd ever been, and he felt clearly and without reservation the specific weight of belonging. Not the idea of it, not the memory of its absence, but the actual living fact of it, present tense happening now. Earned by a single decision made alone in the desert when no one was watching. Years later, people across the city would still tell the story of the runaway who returned the ring. They would get some details right and some details wrong, the way stories always accumulated variations across time and retelling. They remembered the gold ring. They remembered the 14 miles. They remembered the 350 bikers, which was an exaggeration that had entered the story early and stayed because it felt true even if the number was off. They remembered the vote and the letters and the old woman who kept every document her husband had told her to keep. But the people who had been inside the building on the night of the debrief, the ones who had been present for the thing itself rather than the story about it, those people remembered something simpler and more permanent. They remembered a 20-year-old with dirty boots and a broken zipper on his jacket walking across a gravel lot with a ring in his pocket and no plan except to do the right thing. They remembered what it looked like when someone with nothing left chose to be the kind of person they wanted to be. And they knew the way you know things that happen in rooms instead of in headlines, that the ring had never been the point. The ring was just the door. What mattered was what Ethan Parker walked through when it opened. He'd spent 7 months running from a life that wasn't his. He'd walked 14 miles to find the one that was. And from the day he crossed that gravel lot, Ethan Parker never ran again. Because a man with a home, a family, and a purpose has no reason to run and every reason in the world to stay.